Hello everyone, I am the Storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. I pulled up to the front gate of the mansion at dusk, my car headlights catching the old iron bars and thick stone pillars on either side. The property looked deserted from the outside, but I could see a few warm lights in the windows. The place had been turned into a guest house and I'd made arrangements to stay for a few days. I planned to write a book about old buildings, and I was intrigued by the rumors that circled this particular place. People said they sometimes heard voices in the walls and felt strange chills in the hallways. I didn't know if that was true, but I wanted to see everything for myself. I was ready to unpack my bags, settle in, and start exploring. Inside, the foyer was dim. The front desk was a small table with a ledger, an old-style phone, and a brass bell. The manager looked tired. He gave me a quick rundown of the house rules: no smoking inside, meals served in the morning and evening, and no wandering around certain parts of the mansion where the wood floors were weak. He handed me a worn key with a large oval key ring. I noticed it had a strange carved symbol on one side, but I didn't ask about it. My focus was on getting to my room and resting for a bit. I climbed a wide staircase lined with faded portraits. The eyes in those portraits seemed to follow me as I went up. The steps creaked under my weight and the air smelled like dust and old varnish. At the end of the hall, I found my door. The hallway felt a little too quiet, like I was the only one there. I inserted the key and heard a loud click. When I stepped inside, the room felt cold. The window was shut, but it didn't seem to keep the chill out. I flipped the light switch and a single lamp by the bed lit up. The bed looked sturdy with a tall wooden headboard, and there was a small desk in the corner. I placed my bags on the floor and shut the door behind me. I decided to do a quick walkthrough of the house before settling in. The manager had said dinner would be ready at 700 and I had about an hour to look around. I left my room, locked it, and walked back through the hallway. I passed a few other doors, all closed. I heard no voices, no footsteps. My shoes echoed on the floor. When I reached a side corridor, I noticed a door slightly ajar. I peeked inside. It was a lounge with old furniture, a fireplace, and shelves filled with dusty books. A single overhead light was on, casting weak illumination over the chairs. I stepped in and looked around. The air felt stagnant and I caught a faint musty odor like wet paper. I spotted a set of letters on a small coffee table. They looked old, so I picked them up. The envelopes were yellowed and the ink on the addresses was fading. I wanted to read them, but I figured they might belong to the house records. I set them down and made a mental note to ask the manager about them later. Then I heard a soft creak behind me. I turned, but no one was there. A few minutes later, I found the dining room. It was empty, with a large wooden table and a row of chairs. The table had a dull sheen and the lighting was dim. I could smell something cooking from the kitchen, probably soup or stew. I felt my stomach rumble, so I decided to wait there for dinner. As I stood by the window, I looked out at the dark garden. Tall hedges and twisted trees stood like shadows in the distance. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but there was no signal. I cursed under my breath. Maybe it was a glitch or just this old building messing with my re-eye. After dinner, which was a simple meal of soup, bread, and some vegetables, I headed back to my room. The manager told me that I could wander the halls if I wanted, but he advised me not to go to the basement or the west wing. He said those areas were under renovation and not safe. I thanked him and climbed the stairs again. This time the hallway felt different. The lights flickered a bit and I could hear a faint humming noise. I thought it might be the old wiring or the wind outside. I reached my door and went inside. The cold still hovered in the room. I closed the door, changed into more comfortable clothes, and sat at the small desk to write some notes about my impressions of the mansion so far. That's when I heard the first whisper. It sounded like someone saying my name, very soft, stretched out in the darkness. Daniel. I froze, my pen hovering above the paper. I turned, but I saw nothing except the old wallpaper in the bed behind me. My heart started racing. I got up and checked the hallway, but it was empty. I shook my head, thinking maybe I was just tired. I locked the door again and returned to my desk. I took a few deep breaths and started writing about the mansion's layout, my dinner, and the odd feeling in the lounge. My handwriting got sloppy because my hands were trembling a bit. I told myself to relax. Around midnight, I decided to get some sleep. I turned off the lamp, got under the seats, and closed my eyes. I tossed and turned, listening to the house settling. There were lots of creaks, cracks, and clicks. I heard the wind rustling outside. Occasionally I thought I heard a faint voice, but I tried to ignore it. At some point I drifted off. Then I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, because I heard that whisper again, clear this time and right by my ear. Daniel. I jerked up and looked around. My room was dark except for a small line of moonlight coming through the curtains. My breath felt short and rapid. I switched on the lamp. The room looked the same as before: desk, chair, bed, walls, closed door. But my mind felt jumbled. It didn't feel like a dream. I decided to leave the lamp on and stay awake for a bit. I got dressed and opened the door to the hallway. The corridor lights were dim, but enough to see. I didn't hear anything at first. Then I took a few steps and I Heard a soft tapping sound like someone walking with light footsteps. I followed the noise around a corner. I thought I saw a shape at the far end of the corridor near a tall window. It looked like a person, but it was too dark to make out any features. My stomach tightened and I felt a chill across my shoulders. My legs were shaky, but I took a few more steps. The shape seemed to turn and walk away, drifting down another hallway. I called out, "Hello." No answer. I stood there debating whether to follow. A small part of me wanted to run back to my room, but I was too curious. I needed to know if this was a real person or something else. I walked slowly, arms tense at my sides. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the shape, there was only darkness. The corridor stretched on, lined with closed doors and old paintings. One of the paintings was crooked, so I adjusted it on the wall. Then I noticed a slight breeze on my right. It was coming from a hidden door that sat halfway open. I stepped closer and saw that it led to a narrow staircase going down. The manager had said not to go to certain areas, but this might be the way to the basement or part of the west wing. I stared into the dark, listening. I thought I heard a whisper again, faint like a breeze through a gap in a window. I wanted to turn on my phone's flashlight, but my phone was in my room. My pulse beat hard in my ears. I inched forward, letting my eyes adjust. The stairs creaked under my feet. The air got colder the farther I went, and it smelled like damp stone. At the bottom I reached a small corridor with bare walls. Old wooden beams supported the ceiling. There was a single bulb hanging from a wire, and it flickered when I pulled the chain to turn it on. I saw a row of large crates along one wall, plus a few stacks of old books and some rolled up carpets. In the corner there was a small wooden cabinet with a padlock. I noticed some letters on top similar to the ones I'd seen in the lounge. One was partially open, so I picked it up. It was dated 1921. It talked about unusual noises at night and an uneasy feeling of being watched. The writer mentioned hearing soft voices in the corridors. My head felt light as I read this. It mirrored what I was experiencing. I put the letter back and looked around again. The place felt claustrophobic. Suddenly I heard a scraping sound behind me. I spun around, heart racing. A shadow moved across the wall. It looked like a silhouette of a tall figure wearing some kind of old-fashioned coat. I stepped back, bumping into one of the crates. My breath came out in quick gasps. The silhouette moved slowly, then it seemed to vanish. I felt a surge of panic, like I was trapped. My hands shook as I rubbed my eyes, trying to see clearly. The basement was silent again. I grabbed one of the books near me. It was a guest register from 1930. I flipped through and saw entries describing voices calling out in the middle of the night. Some guests wrote that they felt like they were being followed. The text looked shaky, like they wrote it while they were nervous. I swallowed hard. The house had a long history of these experiences. I needed to leave the basement and go back to my room, but my feet felt stuck to the floor. After a moment I forced myself to move. I climbed the stairs, careful not to make too much noise. The door at the top was closed but not locked. I pushed it open and found myself in another part of the mansion. The corridor looked familiar, but the lighting was different. I tried to find the main hallway leading to my room, but I got turned around. At one point I stumbled upon a small sitting area with a dusty couch and an empty fireplace. The air was still and cold. I heard the floor creaked behind me again. The same gentle whisper drifted through the silence, my name over and over. I felt a jolt in my chest every time I heard it. I turned around slowly, expecting to see that shape. Instead, the corridor was empty. My legs were tense and my throat felt dry. I forced my feet to move. I walked until I recognized a painting near the top of the main staircase. Once I found that, I hurried back to my room. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My hands were shaking so much that I fumbled with the lock. A few times I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. My heart pounded hard against my ribs. The mansion felt alive, like it was trying to get my attention in 100 different ways. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and listened. The only sound was the clock ticking softly on the dresser. I waited, expecting another whisper. Nothing came. Eventually I lay down, not bothering to undress. I kept the lamp on again. My eyes burned from being so tired, but my mind was racing. I thought about all those letters describing the same things I was experiencing, the hushed voices, the feeling of being watched, the cold spots. It was all real, or at least it felt real. I wondered if the figure wanted to show me something or tell me something, but I had no idea how to respond. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to rest. When morning came, the light through the curtains woke me. I realized I'd fallen asleep for a couple of hours. Still dressed with the lamp on, my neck felt stiff and my back ached. I got up, splashed water on my face in the small bathroom, and checked my reflection. My eyes were red and I had dark circles. I felt groggy. I thought about leaving the mansion altogether, but I had research to do. I had come here for a reason, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever get another chance to explore a place like this. I also wanted answers about the whispers. Part of me was terrified, but part of me was drawn to it. I went downstairs for breakfast. The manager asked if I'd slept. Well, I hesitated, then just nodded and said everything was fine. He told me that there were some old records in the study if I wanted to look at them for my book. I finished my meal quickly and headed in That direction the study was near the lounge and it had tall shelves lined with ledgers, photos and newspapers about. The mansions past I opened a few dusty books and found references to guests complaining of strange voices and moving shadows. One entry described a figure in the corridors, tall and silent as if guarding something. It felt unsettling to read about the same thing I'd seen. While I was flipping through the pages I heard a tap on the window. I turned to see if it was a branch or something else. But there was nothing there. My shoulders tensed again. I checked the time. It was still mid-morning. The manager told me he needed to run some errands, so I'd be alone in the house for a while. That made my stomach tighten, but I stayed in the study searching through old documents. I found a folder with guest testimonials. Many described insomnia, some sudden chills, and the sound of a voice calling their names. Some had left the mansion earlier than planned because they couldn't handle it. Others believed they were imagining things. I heard footsteps outside the study. I called out, but no one answered. I walked to the door and peeked into the hallway. I saw that shape again at the end of the corridor. This time it stood still facing me. I couldn't see a face, only a dark outline. My pulse hammered. I took a small step forward and it lifted an arm pointing to the side. The movement looked deliberate, like it wanted me to follow. My skin crawled, my breathing sped up, but I stepped out of the study. The figure moved to the left, heading toward a door that I assumed led to the west wing. I walked carefully, maintaining some distance. When I rounded the corner, the corridor was empty. The door was slightly open, leading to a space that was roped off. I lifted the rope and stepped through. Dust covered every surface and the windows were boarded up. It was chilly and dark, but I felt a breeze from somewhere. I took slow steps, scanning the room. I saw old furniture, white sheets draped over chairs, and some scattered letters on the floor. As I bent down to pick up a letter, I heard a whisper from behind me, my name again, soft and urgent. My muscles tensed, and I turned quickly. The shadow street stood only a few feet away. I could feel cold air radiating from it. I clutched the letter in my hand and my heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The figure slowly raised its hand again, like it was offering a warning or maybe a plea. My body felt numb. I wanted to speak, but my mouth was dry. Then I blinked and the figure wasn't there anymore. I exhaled in a shaky burst and looked at the letter in my hand. It mentioned an important message that was never delivered. It talked about a persistent voice that followed a certain guest day and night. The writing stopped abruptly, like the person never finished. I felt a surge of anxious energy. It was clear that these events were not random. Some presence in this house was trying to communicate with me. The voices, the figure, the repeated sightings, they all seemed connected to these old letters. My mind spun with questions, but my immediate thought was that I needed to leave this section of the house. The thick dust and the oppressive cold made it hard to breathe. I put the letter in my jacket pocket and hurried back down the corridor. The rest of the day was spent in a tense state. Every little sound made me jump. Every shift in the shadows felt like someone watching. I kept thinking about the figure pointing and the letters describing the same experiences I was having. I realized that I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The voices called my name. The shape drifted through the corridors. I wasn't sure if it was just the old building playing tricks on me or if something was genuinely trapped here, trying to reach out. My gut told me it was real, but my rational mind fought back. I decided that tonight I would keep my door locked, stay in my room and not wander around. I'd gather my things in the morning and check out. My plan was to leave this place and put distance between me and those whispers before they drove me over the edge. I went upstairs and entered my room. I locked the door, slid a chair under the doorknob and sat on the bed waiting for night to come. My heart still felt tense, and my skin tingled with anticipation. If the whispers started again, I would ignore them. If the figure appeared under my door, I would stay put. I told myself I could endure one last night here no matter what happened. Yet deep down I wasn't sure if I could keep that promise to myself. I stared at the thin walls, wondering if those voices were waiting just on the other side. I didn't believe in strange energy or paranormal things before I brought that painting into my home. I'd heard stories about objects that carried a certain weight, but I always brushed them off. That changed the moment I unwrapped the old frame I inherited from my uncle. It was a large painting of a field of wildflowers under a bright sky. It looked harmless at first. I remember setting it against the wall in my living room, thinking it would add some color to the space. I hung it above the sofa, then stepped back to look at it. The colors were faded, but I saw these soft purple flowers clustered in the foreground. There was a distant tree line, but it appeared calm. My living room felt normal. That afternoon I remember turning on the TV and trying to relax, but my attention kept drifting back to the painting. Something about the colors felt off. There was a cool draft in the room even though I'd closed all the windows. I shrugged it off as a minor house quirk. It was just an old place after all. The next morning I woke up and walked into the living room. The painting looked different. I stared at it for a good minute, my eyes trying to figure out why. I realized that the purple flowers in the foreground weren't as bright. They looked wilted, almost brown at the edges. I blinked, wondering if I'd missed that before. The sky in the background also seemed a shade darker. I felt this cold tension in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. Paintings can look different depending on the lighting, I told myself. Still, I decided to touch the frame. The wood felt unusually cold, like it had been left outside in the wind. My fingertips tingled by the end of that second day. My living room felt heavier. The air seemed dense, almost like a thin fog hung around my eyes. Kept going back to the painting every time I glanced at it. I swore I saw something new. Once I could have sworn I saw a thicker cluster of trees in the background. Another time I thought a narrow path appeared among those trees, like a dark trail leading into a hidden section of forest. When I took a closer look, my stomach turned. I couldn't believe how detailed it was. The brush strokes looked fresh, like they were still wet, but the painting was old. I stepped back, feeling a prickle at the back of my neck. My instincts told me to take the painting down, but I hesitated. It was a family piece after all. That evening I tried to ignore it. I turned off the lights in the living room and went to the kitchen for dinner. While I was eating, I kept thinking about the painting's changes. My pulse felt unsteady. I wanted to check it again, but something about it made me uneasy. After I finished, I walked back, turned on the light, and looked at the painting. From the doorway, it was dark in the field now. The sky was an odd murky shade of gray. The flowers looked drained of color. I felt a chill on my arms. I rubbed them, trying to warm up. The air smelled musty, like wet soil. I couldn't figure out where that scent was coming from. The rest of the house smelled normal. On the third day, I woke up earlier than usual. I was sweating. Even though my room wasn't hot, I went straight to the living room. The first thing I saw was the painting. The flowers in the foreground had lost all their color, and they looked droopy. The tree line in the back looked more pronounced, and the branches had a twisted look. My skin crawled. My heart pounded in my chest. I checked the frame with a small flashlight, trying to see if there was any sort of hidden mechanism. I didn't find anything. The surface of the painting felt unnaturally cold. I pulled my hand away when a sharp tingling sensation ran through my fingers like an electric charge. I stood there, breathing hard. I kept asking myself if I was imagining things. Paint doesn't just change frames, don't give off cold energy. I circled the painting, looking behind it. There was only the wall, no weird wiring, no hidden compartments. I left it hanging there, but a part of me wanted to rip it down and throw it away. Another part of me couldn't let it go. I felt this odd pull toward it, like I needed to check it every few minutes. My stomach felt tight, and I noticed I was clenching my jaw more often. Later that afternoon, I had a friend over to watch a game on TV. He noticed the painting right away. He said it gave him chills. He looked at me with his eyebrows raised. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. I told him it was an inheritance from my uncle. He whispered LED and said something about it feeling cold in the room. I tried to laugh it off, but I felt sweat forming on my forehead. We watched the game for a while, but every so often I'd catch him glancing at the painting. Finally, he got up to leave, complaining that his arms had goosebumps. After he was gone, I stared at the painting again. I noticed the trees in the background had somehow gained more detail. They looked knotted and dark, almost like old bones. I felt a jolt of nausea. I had to sit down. That night I attempted to cover the painting with a heavy blanket. I told myself that if I didn't see it, maybe I could forget about it, but I couldn't sleep. The air in my living room felt strangely thick. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. Around 2 a.m. I got up, walked into the living room, and turned on the lamp. The blanket had slipped off the painting. The lower half was exposed. I moved closer. Even though my hands were shaking, I saw the field was darker. The flowers looked like they'd crumbled. The sky was now a deeper shade of gray, almost black. Near the top, my breath caught in my throat. I touched the frame again. It felt like ice. My teeth started to chatter, and my heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. On the fourth day, I woke up with a stiff neck. My entire body felt tense. I walked straight to the painting, pulled it off the wall, and placed it face down on the floor. Then I took an old sheet and covered it completely. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I tried to go about my day. I cleaned the living room, rearranged furniture, and tried to keep busy, but my mind kept drifting back to that painting. My ears picked up this faint hum, like the sound of a distant fan, but I couldn't figure out the source. I followed the noise, and it seemed loudest near the covered painting. I lifted the sheet a bit. The noise stopped. My pulse raced, and I felt sweat on my neck. I let the sheet drop, then hurried out of the room. That evening I sat in the dark trying to watch a movie. I couldn't concentrate. I paused it and listened to the house. Everything else felt silent, but I sensed movement in the living room, like a slight shift in the air. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check. The sheet was still there, but it looked disturbed, like it had been moved. The corners were bunched up. I froze. I felt a wave of cold gripped my spine. My breathing got shallow. I forced myself to approach it. I touched the sheet, and it felt clammy. I lifted it up and saw the painting again. The wilted flowers were practically gone, replaced by patches of dark ground. The trees at the back looked dense, like a forest. The sky above was thick with dark clouds. It didn't even look like the same painting anymore. My mouth went dry. A chill spread over my skin, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I decided to put it in the garage. I carried it there, holding it away from my body. The frame felt cold, and I could feel the chill spreading to my arms. I kept swallowing, trying to calm myself. I placed it against the wall in the garage and covered it with a tarp. I felt relief for a moment. I didn't want to see it again, but then I realized I'd have to walk past it every time I left the house or return. The idea of that made me uneasy. I tried to sleep that night, but I had nightmares. I dreamt of twisted tree branches scraping against the house. I woke up sweating, my sheets damp. The next day I tried to work from home, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the painting in the garage. Around noon I decided to check it. My hands trembled as I pulled back the tarp. The painting looked even darker. It felt like a scene from a cold wilderness. The twisted tree line took up most of the space now. I saw small details I hadn't noticed before. There were branches sticking out at odd angles, forming bizarre shapes. I felt that same hum in my ears, an eerie static that made my head pound. I dropped the tarp back down. I needed fresh air, so I stepped outside for a while. I managed to stay away from it for the rest of the day, but by evening I found myself drawn to it again. My heart sank each time I thought about it. I hated this feeling, but I also felt compelled to check it. It was like a silent call that wouldn't let me rest, so I went back to the garage, turned on the overhead light, and lifted the tarp again. This time I felt a numbness in my fingertips, like the painting was draining my energy. The sky was almost pitch black, and that forest looked even thicker. I leaned closer, my eyes wide. I noticed a slight opening among the trees, like the entrance to a path. It was so dark I couldn't see the end of it. A wave of dread tightened my chest. My eyes watered from the strain of staring. My hands were shaking so much I dropped the tarp. I stumbled back and nearly fell against a shelf. I decided to try something else. Maybe if I put it in a locked closet I could feel the pull, so I carried it inside. Avoiding eye contact with that dark scene, I placed it in a spare closet and locked the door. Then I slid a heavy box in front of the closet for good measure. I sat on my couch for a while, feeling that strange hum in the back of my head. I could still sense it even through the walls. My living room felt cold. My arms were covered in goosebumps. I turned on every light in the house, hoping that would help. It didn't. I kept glancing at the closet door, expecting it to open on its own. The next several hours were a blur. I kept pacing around the house. My head hurt, my ears rang, the place felt cold and damp. I checked the thermostat. Everything was normal. I pressed my hand against the living room wall. It felt clammy. I couldn't take it anymore. Around midnight I went to that closet, pulled the box aside, and unlocked the door. I grabbed the painting, forced myself not to look at it, and marched outside. The wind was still, the street was quiet. I carried it to my backyard and propped it against the fence. I didn't know what else to do. I stared at the painting under the faint glow of a porch light. It looked nearly black. The twisted forest dominated the entire canvas. The sky was heavy with clouds, and there was a faint glimmer of something in the distance, but I couldn't make out what it was. My heart thudded. My arms felt cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt cornered by this thing. I wanted to tear it apart. I reached for it, but I stopped. A sudden wave of nausea hit me. I thought I would vomit, so I took a few steps back, bending over to catch my breath. My skin prickled with sweat. I had to get it away from me, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. Something in my mind said that was a bad idea. I was too overwhelmed to think clearly. I left it there, leaning against the fence. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and tried to calm down. My heartbeat felt irregular. I grabbed a glass of water and nearly dropped it because my hands were shaking so badly. I sat on the floor of my living room, pressing my back against the sofa. I stared at the front door, half expecting the painting to reappear. I stayed like that for an hour. My breath was shallow, and I tried not to panic. I felt cold. My stomach was knotted. There was no logical explanation for any of this. By early morning I mustered enough courage to open the back door and peek out. The painting was still there, resting against the fence. I didn't approach it. I could feel that chill emanating from it. Even from several feet away, my body tensed up as I stared at it. The forest in the painting looked alive. The branches bent in weird angles. The field at the bottom was practically gone, replaced by bare ground. I could see smears of color that reminded me of dried mud. Right now I don't know what to do with it. It's still out there, and I'm inside trying to keep my thoughts straight. The feeling of unease hasn't left the house. Still feels cold. My skin tingles when I think about that painting. I'm afraid to look at it again, but I also can't stop checking on it. Part of me wants to destroy it, but a stronger part of me feels like that might make things worse. I have no proof of that. It's just a feeling, something in my gut that says if I break it I'll regret it. I never asked for this. I never wanted an old painting, but it's here now, changing, and I can't explain how or why. That's where I stand, stuck in my own home, staring at a painting that seems to be painting itself. Every day it grows darker, as if someone is working on it. From the inside I can't stop looking at it, and I can't bear to keep it around. My body feels weak and my nerves are shot. I'm telling you this because I need someone to hear it. I don't have answers. I just know that something about that painting is wrong. I've never felt this kind of cold energy in my life. It's suffocating now. I'm sitting here trying to keep my mind steady, unsure of what tomorrow will bring, but certain that I can't pretend it's just a painting anymore. It's something else, and I can't escape Yet I moved into this old building 3 weeks ago. I'd heard rumors about its hallways and how people got lost trying to find their own apartments. I always thought those stories were exaggerated. Tonight, though, I'm not so sure. I've just come across something that I can't explain. A door I've never seen before, made of rusty iron and wedged into a corner of a corridor that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It's late and I can't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be here, but I'm standing in front of this door anyway, wondering if I should open it. I first noticed the building's odd layout on my second day here. The corridors twist around in a confusing pattern, and it took me a while to memorize the route from the lobby to my apartment. The walls are covered with old wallpaper that peels in the corners. The floorboards creak in places, and the ceiling bulbs are dim. If you're not careful, you'll find yourself at a dead end that leads nowhere. People say that's part of the charm of a historic place like this, but it's also unsettling when you're coming home late at night. Earlier this evening, I went out to buy groceries. On my way back, I missed a turn because the hallway near the stairwell looked different. The lights flickered. I spotted an extra door that I swear hadn't been there before, but it turned out to be a service closet that should have tipped me off. Strange things happen here. Instead, I just brushed it off. I told myself I was tired from work and needed to get home. I never suspected it was a sign that something else was waiting around the corner. Around midnight, I got restless. I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt stuffy and too quiet, so I decided to explore. I left my place and wandered down the hall with a small flashlight. I didn't bother turning on the overhead lights because I figured I'd just take a short walk, then come back. I walked past the elevator and turned right. Then I went left at a hallway that usually leads to a locked storage room, but I noticed the corridor seemed longer. It extended past the storage room door, which was strange. The air felt heavier. There was a smell of dust and old wood. I kept going. After a few more steps, I saw this iron door on my right. It looked old with red-brown rust around the edges. There was no sign on it, no indication of what might be behind it. I leaned in and tried to hear anything. Inside, it was silent. I tried the handle. It gave way with a squeak, like the hinges hadn't moved in years. When I opened the door, I saw a spiral staircase descending into darkness. I aimed my flashlight down the steps. The staircase looked narrow and made of iron as well. It reminded me of something you'd find in the basement of an old factory, though I won't use any fancy description for it. It just looked worn and unsafe, like it might collapse if I put my full weight on it. Still, it seemed solid enough to hold me. My heart started beating faster. My hands felt a bit clammy on the flashlight. I considered turning around, but something about that hidden staircase pulled me, and I took one step onto the spiral stairs. The metal rang under my foot. I felt a chill crawl up my back. The air smelled damp. I couldn't see anything beyond the small circle of light from my flashlight. I looked over my shoulder. The door was still open behind me. Part of me wanted to prop it open, but it didn't look like it would stay without something to hold it. I picked up a small piece of debris from the hallway floor, a broken door stop or something similar, and wedged it between the door and the frame. It wasn't much, but I hoped it would keep the door from shutting. Then I continued down. At first, I thought maybe I'd find a boiler room or some old storage space, but the steps kept going. The spiral wounded deeper and deeper. After maybe 2 full rotations, I reached a new landing. There was a short corridor here, barely wide enough for me. The ceiling hung low and the walls were made of old brick. I shined my flashlight along the floor. Was covered in dust and small rocks. There was no decoration, no furniture. It didn't feel like part of a normal basement. I saw another section of the spiral stairs continuing down. I glanced back. The way up was there, but the corridor behind me stretched into darkness, and I felt a strange urge to see what was at the end of it. I decided to explore the corridor first. Each step I took made a soft crunch on the debris under my shoes. The air felt even thicker. Here my throat started to twitch. I coughed. After maybe 20 foot, I saw a closed door on the left. I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. I leaned my shoulder into it, but it felt like it was sealed shut. The door was wooden with an old iron knob. No luck. I turned back to the staircase, thinking I'd try going down a bit more before giving up. When I got back to the spiral steps, I noticed the sound of my own breathing echoing around me. My pulse thumped in my ears. Something felt off. I realized the door at the top where I'd come from was no longer visible. I could see maybe 3 turns of the spiral above me, but it was all darkness. Past that, I tried to calm myself. I thought I just needed to climb back up, but part of me wanted to keep going a little farther. I told myself I'd be careful. I told myself I'd turn around as soon as I felt anything too weird, so I went down again. I counted the steps. At first it felt like the same pattern: step, step, metal, clang, echo, and then a new landing, but it took longer this time. I felt like I was going in circles. The spiral was tight, so I kept my right hand on the center column for balance. After what felt like 50 steps, I reached another landing. This one was identical to the first. Same rough brick walls, same low ceiling. Another short corridor, LED off to one side. I took a quick look, saw another locked wooden door, and returned to the staircase. By now my breath was coming faster. I felt sweat on my neck. My flashlight beam trembled a bit. I considered turning around, but I was Curious, or maybe too stubborn, I wanted to see if there was an actual basement, or if this was some weird hidden section of the building. I started walking down more steps. This time I lost track of how many I took because I began hearing sounds. It started as a faint hiss like air escaping through a vent. I stopped and held my breath, pressing myself against the cold metal railing. The sound seemed to come from below me, but it echoed so strangely that I couldn't pinpoint its source. I aimed my flashlight down. The steps just spiraled into darkness. I kept going. My body felt tense, my shoulders were tight, my mind started playing tricks on me. I thought I saw shapes moving at the edge of the flashlight beam, but it was just the curve of the stairs and the faint shadows. After a few more rotations, I arrived at another identical landing. I realized the layout was repeating. Each landing had the same corridor, the same locked door, the same low ceiling. It made no sense. I was expecting some kind of basement level or a sign that I'd reached the bottom, but there was nothing except more stairs going down. The hissing sounds got louder. I thought I heard whispers hidden in the echoes, short bursts of noise that sounded almost like words, but I couldn't make them out. My skin prickled, my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my temples. I flicked the flashlight around quickly, but there was nobody there. The corridor looked empty. The locked door sat at the end like a dead end. I called out hello, but the sound died fast. My own voice bounced back at me, sounding strange. I wiped sweat from my brow and told myself to turn around. I climbed a few steps upward, but I felt an odd sensation like I was stepping into a thicker layer of air. My head felt light and my breathing got shallow. I paused. Leaning on the rail, I heard the hissing again, louder this time. My hands were shaking. I aimed the flashlight up. The spiral just kept going, but it felt darker. The metal steps looked narrower. I realized I wasn't sure how far I descended. It felt like forever. My sense of direction was slipping. I forced myself to keep climbing. I moved one step at a time. Carefully, I tried counting the steps to maintain my focus. 1, 2, 3, but after a while I lost count. The whispers echoed again like they were circling around me. My flashlight started to flicker. I smacked it with my palm. It stayed on, but weaker. I thought about my phone, but I realized I'd left it charging in my apartment. That was stupid. Time passed in a blur. I kept climbing and climbing, but I never saw the door where I'd first entered. The landings all looked the same. Sometimes I turned to look down, but I didn't see anything except the swirl of steps disappearing into the dark. My footsteps echoed. My breathing sounded harsh. The hissing grew into something more urgent, like short bursts of air right next to my ear. I spun around a few times but saw nothing. Eventually I stopped on a landing to catch my breath. My knees ached. My head felt dizzy. I leaned against the wall. The bricks were damp and cold. I felt a drop of water run down the back of my neck. The corridor stretched out, but I didn't bother checking the door. I knew it would be locked. I had this feeling that everything down here was the same. I started to wonder if the building was playing a trick on me or if I'd wandered into some hidden part of it that never ended. I sat on the top step of the next flight and listened. The whispers seemed to come from far away now, but I could still sense them. Every few seconds there was a faint hiss or a soft murmur. My mouth was dry. I swallowed, but my throat felt scratchy. The flashlight was getting dimmer. I told myself I had to keep trying to get back up. I stood up and climbed again. My legs felt shaky. I gripped the railing every few steps. I glanced around the corridor. On each landing looked the same. I tried kicking one of the doors in frustration, but it didn't budge. I yelled help, but it only echoed back. The sound felt hollow. My chest tightened. I realized I was panicking. I tried to slow my breathing, but the short, rapid gasps wouldn't stop. I'm not sure how long I kept at it. At some point I lost track of which direction I was going. The spiral made me dizzy. I started thinking maybe I was going down instead of up. The landings blended together. My flashlight flickered out for a moment. I shook it until the beam returned, but it was weaker than before. My stomach churned. My shoulders burned with tension. My shirt was soaked with sweat. I took a break on another landing and pressed my ear to the locked door, hoping to hear something. Voices, pipes, anything. I heard a faint hiss, then a distant laugh. That might have been my imagination. I jerked back. I felt my heart hammering. I stepped away from the door. I turned toward the stairs again, but couldn't decide which direction was up or down. I pointed my flashlight both ways. It all looked the same. The metal steps, the brick walls, the stale air. I felt trapped. I said out loud, this has to end somewhere. My own voice sounded shaky. I picked a direction that I thought was upward and took a few steps. Then I stopped. The hissing noise swirled around me as if it was coming from every side. My chest felt tight. My fingers were numb. I realized I couldn't see the place I'd come from anymore. The landings above and below merged into one continuous spiral of shadows. I started walking again, not even sure which way I was going. I just wanted to find a door that opened or a sign of an exit. The building had to have limits. There had to be a top or a bottom, but my flashlight's beam began to fade. The circle of light on the steps in front of me got smaller. I forced my feet forward. My lungs felt like they weren't getting enough air. I was hyperventilating. I tried to calm down, but the darkness pressed in from every side. After a few more steps, the flashlight died. Everything went black. My pulse thundered in my ears. I reached out, felt the center column of the spiral staircase and tried to keep moving each time I put my foot on a step. I tested it. Carefully I felt tears in my eyes, but I wiped them away. My mind was spinning with questions about how any of this could be real, but I kept walking one slow step after another, hoping I'd eventually see some kind of light or reach a doorway that led out. I've been at it for what feels like hours. My throat is raw from breathing the stale air. My muscles ache. Sometimes I pause and listen, but all I hear is my own shaky breath and those soft hissing whispers in the distance. They never stop. They swirl around me, getting louder at times, then fading again. I try to talk to myself to stay focused. I say things like stay calm, keep going, but my voice sounds small in this darkness. Right now I'm on another landing. The walls feel cold and damp and I can't see anything. My flashlight is useless. My phone is upstairs in my apartment. I have no idea how to get out. I'm alone with these echoes. Every once in a while I think I see a faint glow somewhere, but when I move toward it, it vanishes. My heart pounds so hard it hurts. The hissing gets closer, like breath on my neck, but there's never anyone there. I'm not sure how long I can keep climbing. My body is exhausted. My mind is reeling. I keep expecting to find a final door, or maybe the one I wedged open at the start, but it doesn't appear. I feel like I'm trapped in this spiral for forever with only these whispering echoes for company. I don't know if I'll ever make it back. I don't even know if there is a way back. All I can do is keep climbing and hope that somewhere up ahead I'll find that rusted door that leads out of this nightmare. Until then I'm stuck here in the dark, listening to the hiss of whatever lives in these endless stairs. I first heard the bell on my second day in that forest. I was squatting next to a clump of ferns, checking their leaves for any signs of fungal growth. The morning was quiet. The air felt dense. Then I heard a single chime. It wasn't loud or echoing, but it was clear enough that I looked up right away. My heart thumped. I didn't see any buildings. There were only thick trees and mossy ground in every direction. I stood there with my mouth half open, listening. Nothing else happened. The bell went silent. I was there on a research project. I was supposed to collect samples of local plants, label them, record growth patterns, and then send everything back to the lab in town. It was routine work. I had done it many times, but never in such an isolated spot. My campsite was at least 2 miles from a dirt road, and that dirt road was itself about 20 miles from any small settlement. There was no reason for a bell to ring out there. I felt uneasy. My skin prickled. My hands felt shaky for a moment, but I forced myself to ignore it and went back to my plants. Later that afternoon I heard the bell again. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere uphill. I tried to follow the direction of the sound, but it faded before I could pinpoint where. The trees were thick and the ground sloped in odd angles. By the time I reached a cluster of ancient pines, I wasn't sure where I had started. The sound never returned. That day at night I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay in my small tent, eyes on the nylon ceiling. I listened to the breeze moving through the leaves. I kept waiting for another chime. Eventually I fell asleep. The next morning I decided to take a more organized approach. I packed up a small backpack with some water and snacks. I took my compass. I also grabbed a small notebook to keep track of my location. Around noon I heard that same bell. It was faint, like it was coming through a layer of thick fabric. I tried to remain calm. I wrote down the general direction. I walked slowly, trying to keep my footsteps quiet, as if I might scare the bell away. After about 15 minutes I heard it again. It sounded a bit clearer. I changed direction and tried to go straight toward it. The undergrowth was dense and the terrain was uneven. My boots sank into patches of wet soil. My jeans got ripped by thorny bushes. I kept going until I reached a small clearing. At first I didn't see anything that looked like a bell. I saw a flat patch of grass. I saw stones covered in moss. Then I noticed a large structure near the center of the clearing. It was made of old dark stones and it looked like an arch. Hanging inside the arch was a metal bell, greenish with rust and age. I felt a rush of adrenaline. My mouth went dry. I swallowed hard. The bell was big, maybe 2 feet wide. There was a thick rope attached to its clapper, but the rope was frayed at the bottom and just hung there unmoving. I approached it carefully. The bell looked like it hadn't been rung by a person in decades. Moss trailed down one side. The arch had cracks running through the stones and chunks of it were missing. I looked around for any sign of footprints or pads, but I only saw untrodden grass. I stood there, my hand on my chest. My pulse felt strong against my palm. The area was silent. I wondered how it had rung at all. I walked a slow circle around the structure, checking for wires or anything that could have made it chime. I found nothing. I stayed in that clearing for over an hour, waiting to see if the bell would ring again. It didn't, so I left, but I noted my exact coordinates in my notebook. I returned to my camp. I ate a quick meal of canned beans and crackers, then tried to relax. That night at around 10 o'clock I was cleaning my mess kit when I heard 3 distinct rings echo through the forest. Each ring was spaced out by a few seconds. My hand jerked so hard I almost dropped my pot. My heart pounded. My stomach felt tight. I grabbed my jacket, turned on my flashlight, and rushed out of my campsite. The sound seemed to be coming from the same direction as before, but it was too dark to navigate properly. My flashlight beam caught trunks and branches I tripped on exposed roots. Eventually I gave up, but I could still hear those 3 rings in my head as I lay awake in my sleeping bag. The next day I packed up more supplies and went back to the bell. Once again it was silent. I stared at it for a long time. I touched its surface. It felt cold even though the day was warm. I gave the rope a little tug and the bell shifted just a bit, making a short clank. I jumped back, half afraid it would unleash some noise, but it stayed silent. Around the arch the grass was thick. Beneath the grass I saw stones set in a sort of rectangular pattern, like a foundation of something that used to stand there. There were no symbols, no inscriptions, everything looked plain, just old. That night I decided to head out to the clearing. In the dark I grabbed my flashlight, some extra batteries, and a small lantern. I wanted to see if the bell would ring on schedule. I arrived around 9 o'clock. The moon was covered by clouds. The clearing felt colder than the rest of the forest. I set up the lantern near the edge, turned it on, and watched the bell. The minutes ticked by. My breath felt short, my shoulders were tense. It was almost 10 when I heard the first ring. It came from the bell itself, but I swear I didn't see the bell move. I felt this rush of heat in my face, like my blood pressure spiked. The second ring came soon after. It echoed in the clearing. My ears tingled and my legs felt weak. The third ring happened and I saw a faint glow inside the bell. It was a soft pale light flickering around the clapper. It looked like a small electric spark, but there was no obvious source. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight onto the bell's interior. My hand shook, the glow faded. I felt dizzy, my heart wouldn't slow down, my throat felt tight. I forced myself to breathe normally. I stayed still, waiting for more rings. None came. I checked the arch, ran my hand along the stones, looked for hidden devices, anything that might create a light. I found nothing. I only felt rough, damp rock and cold metal. I turned off my lantern for a moment and peered inside the bell with my flashlight. It was just empty space, an old metal clapper and some cobwebs, yet it had produced a glow and those rings sounded real. My eardrums were still buzzing. After a while I left more confused than ever. The next few days I tried to stay focused on my research. I documented plants, took soil samples, and mapped out different species of moss, but every afternoon I'd hear a random ring in the distance, and every night around 10 o'clock the bell rang 3 times. I tried to ignore it, but my body refused to stay calm. I'd break out in cold sweats, my chest would tighten, I'd feel a hard thump in my temples. Sometimes the night seemed endless. I'd sit by my campfire waiting, knowing the bells would come, and always did. One evening I decided to bring a small camera to the clearing. I wanted to record the bell. I set up my tripod and aimed it at the arch. At 10 it started. The bell rang once, echoing around me. I pressed record. My hands were clammy. The second ring made my heart pound. I felt the camera shaking under my grip. The third ring came and that same pale light shimmered inside the bell. I stared, my muscles tensed. The light flickered, then died out. I stopped the recording and played it back, but I only heard static. There was no bell sound on my video. I squinted at the screen. The bell looked normal with no glow. It was just dark. My hands started trembling. I kept replaying the clip, convinced I must have missed something. But the video showed me standing in a silent clearing, pointing the camera at a bell that never moved. I left the clearing. I stumbled through the trees, breathing hard. My mouth felt dry. The forest felt oppressive that night. The wind made the branches sway and every noise startled me. When I got back to camp I went straight into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to calm down. I told myself I should leave the next morning, but part of me wanted to figure out what was happening. Sleep barely came. My heart pounded all night. I kept replying the same question, why a bell in the middle of nowhere, and why did only I seem to hear it? The following day I searched for any historical records about the area. On my laptop I had some files stored offline. I found nothing that mentioned a church or a chapel. I tried scanning old maps, no structures, just forest. I walked back to the clearing in the afternoon, determined to study the arch in daylight. I circled it, took pictures, checked every stone. I noticed some stones had chips that looked like they came from tools, but it all looked too worn to identify. At one point I sat on a fallen log near the clearing, writing notes. I was so focused I almost missed the faint ring that echoed again. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I glanced up in time to see the bell sway slightly, but there was no wind. The rope didn't move. The inside of the bell looked dark and still, yet I heard the chime. My pulse slammed in my chest. My fingertips tingled. I felt a lump in my throat. After that I stayed in the clearing until sunset. I wanted to see if something changed before the nightly triple ring. Nothing happened. As darkness fell I turned on my flashlight. I kept my eyes locked on the bell. I was determined not to look away. At 10 when the first ring came I flinched, but I didn't blink. I saw a faint flicker inside the bell, like a small flame. My stomach clenched. The second ring followed. The flicker grew a bit brighter. I took a step forward, ignoring the sick feeling in my gut. The third ring arrived, louder than before. My head throbbed with each beat of my heart. My palms felt slick with sweat. The light glowed stronger for a moment, then vanished once again. The bell hung silently. I reached for the rope, intending to pull it. My hand trembled. The rope felt damp and rough under my fingers. My mind raced. I Wondered if pulling it would provoke another ring or some new phenomenon. I decided to tug it gently. The bell made a dull clang. Nothing else happened. No second glow, no immediate supernatural effect. My breath came out in a shaky exhale. I dropped the rope and stepped back. My shoulders were rigid with tension. I felt like I had tapped into something I wasn't prepared to handle. I left the clearing, wiping the sweat off my forehead with the back of my hand. Back at camp, I tried to write down my observations, but my pen kept slipping. Because my hands were sweaty, I drank some water, ate a protein bar, and tried to steady my nerves. I thought about leaving the forest. No longer felt peaceful. It felt like it was pressing in on me, but I wanted answers. I felt this pull, like I was already in too deep to walk away. I told myself I'd stay one more night. If nothing changed, I'd hike out in the morning. That night the bells rang again at 10. I was in my tent. I felt them more than I heard them. Each ring sent a vibration through my chest. My heartbeat sped up in time with each toll, like I had no choice. I noticed I was gripping my sleeping bag so hard my knuckles turned white. I counted the seconds in my head, waiting for the 3 rings to end. After the last one, my heart rate gradually slowed. My hands were shaking. My mind felt scattered. I tossed and turned for hours, falling in and out of a restless sleep. At first light, I packed up. I couldn't handle another day of that feeling. I put my research samples in a duffel. I stuffed my tent into its sack. I took a final look around the campsite, making sure I hadn't left anything. Then I glanced toward the direction of the bell. I didn't hear it that morning. The forest felt heavy with silence. My chest felt tight as I started walking. The thought of that old bell in the clearing made my scalp prickle. I kept looking back, half expecting to see or hear something. Nothing came. As I hiked away, I realized my heartbeat was still irregular. I felt on edge. Even though I was leaving, the memory of those 3 rings kept echoing in my mind. My steps felt hurried. I wanted distance between me and that clearing. I gripped the straps of my backpack and pressed forward, trying to focus on each footstep. The forest was just a forest again, but it didn't feel calm to me. I wanted out. I didn't plan on coming back. It took me about 3 hours to reach the dirt road. The whole time I heard no more bells. I was relieved, but I couldn't stop replaying the nightly ringing in my head. My heartbeat would spike every now and then for no reason. I forced myself to keep going until I finally reached my car. Then I slumped behind the wheel, hands still shaking a bit. I stared at the steering wheel and took a few deep breaths. I turned the key and drove off, leaving that place behind, but I can still feel that pressure in my chest. When I think about that bell, I can still remember that flicker of light, and I know I never found a real explanation. I never expected to feel uneasy about an ordinary mirror, but the one I brought home from the antique shop was different. It had a thick gold-colored frame with swirling shapes on the edges. It felt heavier than it looked. And the shop owner didn't say much about it. He just wrapped it up and took my money without making eye contact. I shrugged it off and left, thinking I had found a unique decoration for my living room. I wish I had walked away instead of buying it. I carried the mirror into my house around noon. The hallway was bright, and I remember noticing how the glass caught the light in a strange way. It felt warmer to the touch than I expected. I placed it against the wall near the front door. I wanted to see how it looked before hanging it. I stepped back and glanced at my reflection. That was when I noticed the first small discrepancy. My hair looked the same, my face looked the same, but there was a dark spot on the shoulder of my shirt in the reflection. I looked down at my actual shirt and saw nothing. The fabric was clean. It made me pause. I looked back up and the spot was gone. The reflection was normal again, and I figured it was just a smudge on the glass. I went to the kitchen, grabbed some glass cleaner, and wiped the mirror until it looked spotless. That afternoon I walked past the mirror several times, checking out my reflection without thinking about it too deeply. There was this slight flicker at the edges, like my reflection was lagging a fraction of a second behind my movements. I frowned at it and assumed it was my imagination. I work long hours, so I told myself I was just tired. I decided to place the mirror in the living room above a small table I have near the window. It took some effort to hang it. I used a level tool, hammered in a solid nail, and carefully lifted the mirror into place. When it was done, I stood there to admire my work. I walked to the center of the living room to see if it was aligned properly. I glanced at the mirror's reflection of the space behind me. Everything seemed correct. My couch was where it should be. The curtains were drawn to one side and the lamp was in the right corner. Then I noticed a door behind me in the reflection. It was the door that leads to my basement storage area in real life. The door was closed, but the mirror showed it slightly open. It wasn't a big gap, just a crack, but it was enough to see darkness inside. I actually spun around to check. The door was closed. I looked back at the mirror, and now it matched reality. The door was closed in the reflection as well. A wave of nervousness ran through me. My arms felt a little shaky, but I told myself that I must have seen some reflection of the basement door handle in a weird angle. I tried to ignore the feeling. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking I heard soft creaking noises, but I couldn't figure out if it was just the house settling. Around midnight I went to the kitchen to get water. I felt drawn to the living room, so I walked over and flicked on the lamp. The mirror was there, reflecting my shadow from the weak light. I stepped closer. I leaned in until I could see my face in the reflection. My eyes looked a bit bloodshot from lack of sleep, but there was no strange spot or flicker. I started to feel foolish for being on edge. Right as I was about to turn away, I heard something from the mirror. It was a small tapping sound. It was faint, like a soft knock. My heart raced. I took a step back, expecting to see a crack or maybe a bug behind the glass. The mirror's surface was clear. I touched the frame, ran my fingers along the golden edges, and felt my pulse pounding. It was quiet again. I stood there for a few more seconds, breathing heavily. Eventually I returned to bed, but I couldn't sleep much after that. The next day I went to work feeling exhausted. I have a small office job that requires me to focus on documents and data entry. I was distracted at all morning, glancing at my phone to check the time, wondering what I would see when I got back home. I told one of my coworkers about the weird mirror. He laughed and said antique mirrors often have imperfections. He joked that maybe I was living in a haunted house. I forced a chuckle, but I felt tense inside. It was the way the reflection seemed to shift that bothered me. I kept thinking about that spot on my shirt in the basement door. I tried to brush it aside and focus on my tasks. When I got home that evening, I stood in my living room doorway and looked at the mirror from a distance. The reflection showed the entire living room, including the hallway and the basement door. Everything was in place. The door was closed. The furniture looked normal. The curtains were open just like they really were. I felt a little relieved. I made some dinner, ate it while watching TV, and then decided to take a quick shower before settling in for the night. After my shower, I walked back into the living room to turn off the lamp. I froze when I noticed the mirror. This time the reflection showed me walking around in the kitchen as if I was standing there cooking, but I wasn't in the kitchen. I was right in front of the mirror. I could see my own figure in the background of the mirror's reflection, wearing the same outfit I had on at that moment, but my reflection was doing something else. It was stirring a pot on the stove and looking at the cabinets. It lasted only a second before snapping back to a normal reflection of me standing by the lamp. I stumbled back against the couch, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to speak out loud, but my throat felt dry. I just kept staring at the mirror, expecting it to change again. My forehead was damp with sweat. After a long moment, I grabbed my phone and thought about calling someone, maybe my coworker, to come see this for themselves, but then I imagined them laughing at me. I put my phone down and walked closer to the mirror. I reached out and pressed my palm against the glass. It felt cold and solid. I could see a faint reflection of my hand lined up with my real hand. Nothing unusual happened. Right then I exhaled heavily, turned off the lamp, and headed to my bedroom, leaving the mirror alone. I just wanted to sleep and forget about it. That night I woke up to a soft thudding sound. It was faint but rhythmic, like footsteps on a stair. It took me a few seconds to realize it was coming from the living room. My heart started pounding again and my mouth went dry. I slid out of bed, flipped on the hallway light, and stood outside my bedroom, listening. The thewing continued. I walked slowly toward the living room, feeling my skin prickling with goosebumps. When I reached the living room, I saw that the basement door was wide open. I never leave that door open. It sticks a bit, so I usually have to tug it hard to open or close it, but now it was open and I could see darkness on the stairs that lead down to the storage area. I glanced at the mirror. The reflection showed something else. It showed me standing there, but my reflection was turned around facing the basement door. In the reflection, I shifted my eyes back and forth from the mirror to the actual door. I could see the mirror version of me stepping through the doorway, in the reflection walking into the basement, while the real me was frozen in the living room, too scared to move. My stomach churned. I felt a chill crawling up my arms. I wanted to close the basement door, but I was afraid to step any closer to the mirror. I kept thinking, this is ridiculous, it's just a mirror, but every muscle in my body felt tense. I forced myself to inch forward. As I moved, I watched my reflection out of the corner of my eye. It seemed to keep pace with me now, matching my movements. I reached the basement door and pulled it shut. My reflection did the same. I heard the door latch click. Then I ran my hand across my forehead, wiping sweat away. I felt slightly better knowing the basement door was closed, but I also felt like something was behind that door, listening or waiting. I checked the mirror again. My reflection showed me standing in front of the closed basement door. It was accurate for a moment, then a flicker of movement appeared in the background of the reflection. It looked like a shape sliding across the hallway floor, but I heard nothing in real life. I whipped my head around to see if someone was behind me. The hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shape in the reflection was gone. I felt my skin crawling with fear. My breathing was quick. My heartbeat thumped in my ears. I hurried back to my bedroom and locked the door. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to steady my breathing. My fingers were trembling. I listened for any more sounds. The house was quiet. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Eventually I lay down, but I didn't get much rest. The next morning I decided I wanted that mirror gone. I got dressed and marched to the living room with the intention of taking the mirror off the wall and putting it in the garage, but when I looked at it I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My hand hovered near The frame, I felt a cold sensation radiating from the glass. My stomach turned and my forehead broke out in sweat again. I ended up stepping back and walking away. I felt frustrated with myself. I tried to calm down in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. I stared at the living room entrance. My chest fell tight. An hour later, I got the courage to call the antique shop. I wanted to ask if they had more information about the mirror. The call rang several times. Nobody answered. I dialed again, still no answer. I felt helpless. I paced around my kitchen, occasionally glancing at the mirror in the other room. I was afraid it would show something else if I looked too long, but I felt its presence, like it was waiting for me to do something. I forced myself to approach the mirror one more time. I watched my reflection. It was me wearing my work clothes, looking pale. I reached forward with both hands. The surface felt cool. I could see the tension in my arms. My head ached from lack of sleep. I tried to lift the mirror off the wall, but it wouldn't budge. It felt much heavier than before. I strained, but the frame stayed in place. I got a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer, thinking I might remove it from the wall altogether. As soon as I tried to slide the screwdriver behind the frame, a loud scratching sound came from the mirror. It startled me. I dropped the screwdriver on the floor. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the tool and backed away again, shaking. I heard the same tapping noise as before, a soft rapping on the glass. It was consistent, like someone was on the other side of the mirror trying to get my attention. My eyes locked onto the reflection. I saw my reflection's lips moving, but there was no sound. It looked like it was trying to speak or call out, but the real me stood there silently. I felt nausea rising in my stomach. I took another step back, but the reflection remained close to the glass, lips forming words I couldn't understand. My ears rang. My breathing was shallow. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my temples. I wanted to get out of the house. The front door was behind me, so I ran for it. I grabbed my coat and slipped on my shoes, not taking my eyes off the mirror. For more than a second, the reflection in the mirror was showing the hallway behind me now, but the front door was closed. In the reflection in real life, I could see it wide open. This mismatch made my skin crawl again. As I moved outside, I caught one last glimpse of the mirror. The reflection showed me walking away, but the version in the mirror was smiling slightly, like it was satisfied. I closed the door and stood on my porch, breathing in the chilly air. I felt relief being out of the house, away from the mirror. I decided right then that I would find a way to remove it. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I couldn't keep living with that thing inside. My hands still shook and I had sweat running down my back. My mind was racing through options: smashing it with a hammer, throwing it in a dumpster, or maybe taking it to a professional who could handle cursed objects. I wasn't sure what would work, but I knew I had to do something. I stood there on the porch until I felt steady enough to walk to my car. I drove around for a while trying to clear my head. I passed by another antique store and considered going in to ask for help, but I felt foolish. I just kept driving, going nowhere in particular, until I realized I needed to face the problem eventually. I don't have a final plan yet. I'm still outside my house, writing this down on my phone so I don't lose track of the details. I can see the living room window from here. The curtains are partially drawn and the mirror is somewhere behind that wall waiting. I'm thinking about going in with a hammer or maybe covering the mirror with a sheet, but I have a terrible feeling it won't be that simple. I can't avoid it forever though. If I leave it there, I might end up seeing more reflections that don't match my reality. And I can't keep living with that feeling of something creeping up behind me, waiting to replace my own reflection. I'll have to face it. I'm not sure what will happen, but I know I can't let that mirror control my life any longer. My heart is pounding, but I'm about to go back inside. I'm determined to do something before it tries to keep me inside its reflection for good. I felt uneasy the second I stepped onto that old farmhouse porch. The boards creaked under my boots and the air felt stale against my face. I heard the wind whipping through the cornfield, creating that dry rustling sound that never seems to stop. I had never spent more than a weekend in a place like this. My father decided to hand over this property to me after he moved to the city. At first I thought it would be a chance to disconnect from everything. Then I saw the scarecrow. It stood out there in the middle of the corn like some silent figure. Its head was tilted forward and its eyes looked like polished stones even though it was still daylight. Those eyes picked up the sunlight in a way that made them glow a little. I felt a pit in my stomach, but I tried to shrug it off. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked inside the house. The living room was musty. Dust particles hung in the air, and the furniture felt old and rough. I opened a couple of windows to let in some fresh air. Then I set my bag on a beat-up armchair and walked back outside to get a better look at the land. The corn was tall, higher than my shoulders. The soil looked dry. There was an old barn on the left side, paint peeling from its walls. The scarecrow stood in the center of the cornfield wearing a tattered shirt and baggy pants. Its straw stuffed arms were stretched out. I noticed the hat on its head was cracked and dirty with a few missing patches, but the part that stuck with me was those eyes. They weren't dull. They had a slick reflective quality like glass marbles. I moved around to the back of the house to check the small generator. When I turned, I saw the scarecrow's head from a different angle. It didn't seem to be looking at me, then I figured I was just getting jumpy, so I carried on. I tested the generator. The gas smelled stale and the machine made a coughing noise before firing up. That short burst of noise echoed around the empty property, then faded into the rustle of leaves. I leaned against the house wall for a moment and looked toward the corn. The scarecrow was still there by the time night came. I felt tired from cleaning and unpacking. I turned off the lights in the living room and looked out the window. The moonlight cast a faint glow on the corn. I saw the top of the scarecrow's head above the rows, its eyes reflected the moonlight like two wet stones. I stared for a moment and my breath caught in my throat. I felt an odd pressure in my chest. I told myself it was just a scarecrow, a stupid piece of cloth and straw. I forced myself to walk away from the window and head to bed. I didn't sleep well. The wind outside sounded like whispers brushing against the windowsill. I kept thinking I heard footsteps on the dry dirt. At one point I sat up in bed because I was sure I heard a crunching sound right under my window. I waited for a few seconds holding my breath. My ears were tense, my mouth felt dry. Then I told myself it was probably a branch falling or something like that. Eventually I drifted off. The next morning I walked out to the porch with a cup of cheap coffee in my hand. I looked across the yard and into the cornfield. The scarecrow's arms were in the same position, but its torso seemed to be angled differently. It was slight, but I could have sworn the thing had turned a few degrees. I actually felt my stomach tighten. The wind wasn't strong enough to shift that scarecrow. It was mounted on a thick wooden post. I took a deep breath and decided to check it out up close. When I reached the scarecrow, I noticed something on the ground. The dirt had these weird shapes etched into it. They looked like spirals inside circles. Some lines shot off in random directions. I bent down and touched one of the grooves. The soil was a little damp, like it had been disturbed recently. I got a whiff of something earthy and bitter. I stood back up and looked at the scarecrow's face. The head was made from a burlap sack with the eyes sewn in, but the eyes weren't normal buttons. They were smooth and shiny like actual stones. I tapped one with my finger and it felt cold. It reflected my own image back at me. I stepped away and looked around, expecting to see someone else out there. I saw nothing but corn stalks swaying in the breeze. Over the next few days I kept myself busy. I repaired a loose board in the kitchen floor. I checked the roof for leaks. I tried not to think about the scarecrow, but every time I glanced at it from the window I felt this little jolt in my chest. It started to get under my skin. On the third night after I turned off the lights, I looked outside again. The scarecrow was turned more toward the house. I wasn't imagining it. Its torso faced my direction. Those glassy eyes picked up the moonlight, sending little glint toward the living room window. I locked the door and shut the curtains. My heart pounded. I lay on the couch with a blanket over me, listening to the wind and every soft creak the house made. That same night I heard the distinct sound of footsteps moving slowly across the yard. It wasn't the house settling, it wasn't the wind. It sounded like someone stepping on gravel, one crunch at a time, deliberate and cautious. I held my breath. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. My palm started to sweat. I thought about getting up and checking, but I felt frozen. Eventually the steps faded. Then I heard rustling in the corn, like somebody was walking between the stalks, pushing them aside. The next morning I woke up stiff and sore on the couch. I went out the front door and walked around the property looking for footprints. I couldn't find any solid shoe prints, but I noticed more of those strange symbols carved into the dirt near the edge of the cornfield. They were bigger this time, like someone had used a stick or a tool. I crouched down and traced one of the spiral patterns with my finger. The edges were sharp, like it had been done overnight. I shivered. My arms felt cold, and I realized I was sweating. I looked up and saw the scarecrow leaning forward a bit. I backed away. I decided I needed to remove it, or at least inspect the post. I grabbed a claw hammer from the barn and marched into the corn. The air felt thick. I couldn't hear birds or any usual morning sounds. It was just the rustle of the corn stalks. When I reached the scarecrow, I took a firm grip on the wooden post. I yanked, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, pressing my foot against it for leverage. The post felt like it had grown into the ground. I hammered at the base, but it barely splintered. It sounded almost like striking solid rock. My head started pounding from the effort. My eyes felt strained. After a few minutes I gave up. Panting, I looked at the scarecrow's face, and those eyes seemed to watch me. My chest tightened again. I hurried out of the cornfield back to the barn and left the hammer on a workbench with shaky hands. That evening the moon was bright. I sat on the porch with a flashlight, scanning the yard. Every few minutes I felt jumpy. My leg bounced up and down. I clutched the flashlight until my knuckles turned white. Around midnight I heard a rustling in the corn again. It was louder than before, like something was moving through the stalks at a steady pace. I aimed my flashlight toward the field, but I couldn't see anything from that angle. My breathing got ragged. I wanted to run back inside, but I forced myself to stand. Then I saw a flicker of movement among the rows. A shadow passed between the tall stalks. I heard a faint crunch of dirt and snapped leaves. I felt a rush of goosebumps all over my arms. I held my breath and watched the movement stop. I clicked off the flashlight and backed into the house, locking the door behind me. When I checked the scarecrow the next morning, it was leaning forward even more, almost as if it were about to fall off the post, but it didn't fall. Those symbols were back in the dirt all around. The base, they formed a ring, each shape connecting to the next. The circle surrounded the scarecrow's post, and the lines extended in odd directions. I walked around it slowly, feeling my chest tighten, my mouth felt dry, and my hands started to shake. I had this thought that something old and strange was tied to that spot. I couldn't explain why, but I felt it. I decided to call a friend who lived a few towns over. When I told him about the scarecrow and the weird symbols, he just laughed and said maybe I was too tired or letting the solitude get to my head. He offered to come by on the weekend and help me yank it out of the ground. That gave me a little relief, so I waited for a couple more days, but the nights were getting worse. I heard more footsteps, sometimes circling the house. I woke up once to see the doorknob rattling lightly as if someone tried to turn it. I stood there in my pajamas, holding my breath and clenching my fist. The noise stopped. After a few seconds, my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. On the day my friend was supposed to arrive, I stood on the porch and watched the driveway, but he never showed up. I tried calling, but the phone signal was weak. I couldn't reach him. By mid-afternoon, I walked back out to the scarecrow. Now it was angled so far forward that its face pointed toward the house. Those eyes reflected even the weak daylight. The ring of symbols around the post looked deeper. The lines in the soil had been carved again with fresh edges. I stomped on one of the patterns, trying to break it, but I slipped and almost fell. My breath came in short bursts and I felt a tingle in my arms. I had this urge to leave, but I also felt a strange pull to figure out what was happening. That night I placed a chair by the window with a direct view of the field. I turned off all the lights. The moon was big and bright again, washing the corn in pale light. The scarecrow was in the same position, that forward lean, the arms slightly spread. I sat there, tired and tense, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I saw a flicker of movement at the base of the scarecrow. Something dark moved around the post, crouching low. I squinted, my heart pounding. I heard a scraping sound, metal against wood. Then I heard a soft grunt or hiss. My body felt paralyzed. My mind raced. I wanted to look away, but my eyes stayed fixed on that shape. Suddenly the scarecrow shifted. It jerked back, then tilted as if something was pushing or pulling it. I swore under my breath. I started to get up, but my legs felt weak. I forced myself to flick on a lamp. The sudden light flooded the room and I couldn't see anything outside. For a few seconds I heard rustling from the corn. Then everything was still. When my eyes adjusted, the scarecrow looked the same as before, except now it seemed slightly twisted at the torso. I felt a wave of nausea. I paced around the living room. I considered calling the sheriff, but what would I say that my scarecrow was moving? At night before dawn, I left the house with a shovel and a piece of rope. I was done waiting. I marched through the corn until I reached the scarecrow. The air smelled damp and I could see my breath. My stomach churned with anxiety. I jammed the shovel into the dirt around the post, trying to loosen it. I wrenched the blade back and forth. My arms burned. After a few minutes I heard a snap. The post finally shifted. I wrapped the rope around the scarecrow's torso and pulled with everything I had. My muscles screamed in protest. The post wobbled, then I managed to yank it out of the hole. Dirt crumbled around the base. I saw something on the bottom of the post, some dark residue that looked wet like tar. My vision blurred for a moment and my head pounded. I dragged the scarecrow away from the circle of symbols, across the field and over near a patch of bare ground behind the barn. I dropped it there and took a few steps back, trying to catch my breath. The scarecrow lay on the ground, arms spayed, the eyes staring at me from that burlap face. I rubbed my temples, feeling shaky. I didn't know what to do next. I just knew I had to keep it away from that spot in the middle of the corn. When the sun came up, I walked to the house, ignoring the stinging pain in my shoulders and hands. I planned to load the scarecrow into my truck and dump it far away from here, but when I returned, it was gone. The rope was still there, coiled in the dirt. The ground looked disturbed, as if something had scraped across it. I searched the area, breathing hard, sweat dripping down my forehead. I heard the corn rustling again, but it sounded distant. I didn't see the scarecrow anywhere. My thoughts raced. I wanted to pack my things and leave, but I felt stuck, like I couldn't abandon this place without knowing what was going on. I'm still here now, pacing around the house and checking the windows every few minutes. There's no sign of the scarecrow. Behind the barn, the cornfield is dead quiet, but I can't stop glancing at it. I feel like those stone eyes are waiting for nightfall. The silence is unnerving. My heart beats heavily and my hands keep shaking. I can't hear anything except my own movements. I'm afraid to go out there again, but I also can't stand the tension. I'm standing by the window, watching the rows of corn. I'm waiting for some sign of movement. I'm waiting for that cursed scarecrow to show itself again, and I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me from somewhere close, still keeping that constant, impossible vigil over this land. I never expected to find anything strange in my parents' house. I just wanted to fix it up, sell it, and move on. The place had been empty for years. The roof had leaks, the paint was peeling off the walls, and the entire structure Smelled like stale air. I drove over on a Friday morning and parked out front. The yard was overgrown, there were weeds everywhere and a few pieces of trash blown in from the street when I opened the front door. Dust rose in the air and made me cough. The main rooms were exactly how my parents left them, furniture covered in dusty sheets, old family photographs on the walls, and a thick layer of grime on every flat surface. I felt uneasy right away, but I told myself it was just the general gloom of an abandoned home. I planned to start in the basement. That was always a trouble spot when I was growing up. The sump pump down there used to fail all the time, and I remembered my dad complaining about water seeping in. I figured I'd check the basement first, then move upward through the house. I opened the basement door and flipped the light switch, but the bulb didn't turn on. I used my phone's flashlight and walked down the steps. Each step creaked. At the bottom I saw water covering the floor. It was about ankle deep, but it looked stagnant. It had a dark brown color and it smelled old. It smelled rotten, almost like dirty laundry left out for weeks. My stomach tensed up. I shined my phone's light around. The old shelves were water-damaged. Cardboard boxes had split open and some old tools were rusted. The water made a faint trickling sound against the walls as if it was trying to find a way out. I noticed some pipes in the corner near the sump pump. They were partially submerged. I figured I'd need a bigger pump to clear this. There was no sense in trying to fix anything until I got that water out of there. I felt annoyed, but I also felt a little rush of adrenaline. I liked the idea of solving a problem even if it was gross and damp. I went to the hardware store and bought a heavy-duty submersible pump. I also got thick rubber gloves and boots. I took everything back to the house and set up the pump in one corner of the basement. I ran a hose outside through a small window so the water would drain onto the lawn. When I plugged in the pump, it hummed and started sucking water. I watched the water level slowly go down. At first I was relieved, then about 10 minutes later I heard a sound. It was a muffled hum. I felt my skin prickle and I turned my head to see if there was something behind me. There was nothing there, just the walls and the moving water. I tried to shrug it off. I blamed the pipes or maybe the pump itself. As the water drained I heard that hum again. It sounded like a voice trapped underwater, but I couldn't make out words. My ears started ringing and I couldn't tell if I was just imagining it. I moved closer to the pump. The noise got louder, but I still couldn't understand it. Then I heard something that sounded like my name. It was low and garbled, but I felt certain I heard it. My heart started pounding. I turned off the pump. The moment I did, the hum stopped. The basement was quiet except for my breathing. I stood there with my flashlight scanning the basement walls. Water was still draining out of the pump hose, but at a much slower rate because I turned the power off. The basement had a strange echo. The dripping from the ceiling joists sounded louder than before. My phone battery was running low and the basement light was dead. I decided to leave the pump off for the day and come back with better lighting. I locked up the house and drove home trying to calm myself. I told myself I was stressed. I even thought maybe the sound was wind passing through cracks in the foundation. The next day I arrived with a proper flashlight, some extra bulbs, and a new fixture for the basement. I installed the light fixture hoping the electrical lines were still okay. It took a bit of fiddling, but eventually I got it to work. A single bulb lit the basement. The water had come back overnight. The basement was flooded again, just as high as before. The pump was still in place, but it was half submerged. My frustration grew. I didn't understand how the water was returning that fast. I pulled out my phone to call a plumber, but I decided to try draining it again by myself. I turned on the pump. The hose outside spewed water onto the grass. I watched the level drop. 10 minutes and I heard the hum. It had the same garbled quality as before, like a voice behind a wall. It kept coming in short bursts. My muscles tensed and my jaw locked. I felt sweat beading on my forehead. Even though the basement was cold, the sound grew clearer. It said my name again. My flashlight shook in my hand and I caught myself standing completely still. The pump roared and the basement light flickered for a second. I turned and saw the water move in a circular pattern. It was forming a shape that looked like a head and shoulders rising. I felt my pulse in my neck. The shape vanished when the pump stuttered. The water swirled around it, then settled into an uneven ripple. I turned off the pump and stared at the water. My breath was quick and shallow. I waited a few seconds, then walked over to the center of the basement. I tried to see if there was some trick with the water flow. My boots sloshed through the water. It rose almost to my calves. Now I leaned in and reached a hand into the water. It felt cold and slimy. I touched the concrete floor. I felt no openings or strange currents. I stood up and braced myself. My nerves were on edge. I felt a pang of fear in my chest, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I decided to go upstairs and check the plumbing lines from the main floor. I went to the bathroom and kitchen, but I didn't see any major leaks. The pipe seemed old but intact. I went back to the basement stairs and looked down. The water was calm again. I flipped on the pump one more time to see if I could catch that shape. The motor hummed. The water started draining. I stayed at the top of the steps with the flashlight aimed at the floor below. After a few minutes, that low hum came back. It started like a faint vibration that built in volume. It sounded like someone saying Thomas, which is my name. I gripped The railing, my whole body felt cold, then the water changed shape again, a torso. And arms pushed up from the surface. It had the outline of shoulders and a head. I heard it say Thomas the First almost. Dropped the flashlight, my heart hammered in my chest. I switched off the pump and the shape sank back into the water. The hum stopped, my own breath sounded too loud in the silence. I turned off the basement light and locked the door. I walked outside, got into my truck and just sat there. My hands were shaking. I didn't know who to call. I thought about calling a friend, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I returned to the hardware store and asked for advice about heavy flooding. The clerk suggested a stronger pump or even a backup system. I bought a second pump. I also grabbed a few floodlights and some rubber sheets. My plan was to drain the water as fast as possible and try to spot any hidden cracks or holes. I wanted to see if there was an underground spring or something else feeding into the basement. I refused to think about the shape or the voice. That evening I set up both pumps in different corners of the basement. I placed the floodlights around the wall so there were no dark areas. The basement looked bleak under the bright light with stained concrete and rusted pipes. I turned on the pumps at the same time. The water started to drain quickly. For a few minutes nothing happened. Then I heard the hum. I tensed up and forced myself to keep watching. The water churned. My name echoed in that garbled voice. The shape rose more defined then. Before I saw what looked like a human face formed from flowing water. It had no distinct features, but I could see indentations where eyes and a mouth would be. The arms moved in slow motions, as if trying to reach me. I felt my knees weaken. My breathing was ragged. My head pounded. I shut off the pumps and the figure collapsed into the flood. I dropped to my knees in the water. My jeans got soaked. My body was shaking. I stayed there for a few seconds. All I could think was that something was under that water and it wanted to come out. I left the pumps off and backed away from the center of the room. I leaned against the wall, feeling the cold concrete on my back. My mind raced, but I tried to stay present in the moment. I didn't want to run away, but I also didn't want to power up the pumps again. Instead, I got a mop and tried to move some water into the nearby drain by hand. My heart rate slowly came down. I moved the mop back and forth. It helped a little, but not much. The water level was still too high. I didn't want to stay in that basement all night. I decided I would return in the morning with a professional plumber. I called one on my way out and scheduled an early appointment. I tried not to think about the watery shape. I tried to focus on driving carefully. I went home, ate a cold dinner, and barely slept. I had constant nightmares about water flooding my room. The next day the plumber arrived. He was a middle-aged guy with a serious expression. I showed him the basement. The water was high again, but he didn't see anything unusual. He set up his own pump and started draining. We stood there for a long time waiting. I kept expecting to hear that hum or see something. Nothing happened for almost half an hour. Then the plumber walked over to some pipes and started checking for cracks. I stayed near the center of the room staring at the water. My stomach twisted into knots. The hum started again, very faint. I froze. The plumber didn't seem to hear it. He kept tapping on the pipes. Then I heard the voice. It was soft and muffled, but I recognized my name. The plumber still didn't react. I took a step closer to the water. The hum rose in volume and the shape formed again. It reached out and said my name, came with more force. I swear I felt a slight vibration under my feet like an underground rumble. I called for the plumber, but when he turned around the shape sank back into the water. He looked at me and asked what was wrong. I told him I thought I saw something in the water, but he just shrugged. He kept working on the pipes. I felt sweat trickle down my temple. The plumber found a small crack, but nothing that would explain the constant flooding. He said the foundation might be compromised. He recommended calling a foundation specialist. He left around noon. I stayed behind. I sat on the basement steps staring at the water. I felt a strong urge to let the pump run. Maybe I could see the shape at its most solid point and figure out what it was. I plugged in both pumps again. Water gushed through the hoses. I watched the water level drop. My heart pounded. I heard the hum grow louder. My arms trembled. The silhouette started to rise from the center of the flood. It was taller and clearer than before. It had a visible head, neck, and torso. I heard it call my name. I smelled a musty odor from the water. My vision blurred at the edges. I stared at this shape, trying to see if it had eyes or a mouth. The water swirled in place and I noticed the arm stretching toward me. My entire body tensed. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I felt a thickness in my throat. The silhouette stood there. For a long moment I heard dripping from the walls. The pumps kept whirring. The shape advanced a few inches, then wavered. The voice sounded desperate. My name came out in a slow, distorted tone. I panicked. My hand slammed against the pump switch, and I turned it off. The shape collapsed. The water soused and the basement went quiet. I stood there with my boots sinking into the wet floor. My muscles felt like they were about to fail. I walked backward until I reached the steps. I went upstairs, locked the door to the basement, and leaned against it. I was convinced there was something in that water. It wasn't normal. It was calling me, and it wanted out. I spent the rest of the day trying to decide what to do. I paced around the kitchen, checking the phone, debating whether to call someone else. I looked through some of my parents' old documents. I found receipts for foundation repairs from decades ago, but No mention of anything else. I didn't see any reference to a hidden cistern or a. Well, by evening I realized I needed more specialized help. That basement wasn't just flooded, it held something I couldn't explain. I made a plan to call a team that dealt with unusual structural issues, but I felt unsure if they'd know what to do. I also felt a growing sense of dread. I closed the curtains and tried to rest on the old couch in the living room. I dozed off for a while. When I woke up, it was dark outside. I decided not to go near the basement again that night. I left the pumps off. If the water rose again, so be it. I couldn't face that voice alone. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about the shape that formed out of the water. I recalled how it said my name. I wondered if I should abandon the house altogether. Then I remembered that it belonged to my parents and I had a responsibility to fix it. I stared at the ceiling for hours. Every little sound made me jump. My thoughts kept returning to that watery figure. Eventually I got up, drank some water from the kitchen sink, and sat at the table until dawn. My body was stiff and my eyes burned. As soon as it was light, I gathered my things and walked out the front door. I drove off to find help, determined to find a professional who could handle this. I didn't turn back once my parents' house stood behind me, silent and flooded with that voice somewhere in the basement waiting. I had no idea what it really was, but I knew I couldn't face it alone. I never planned on finding something strange in my own attic. I only went up there to deal with the mess that had piled up over the years. I live with my partner in a 2-story house and we both agreed it was time to clean every corner. We had boxes of old clothes, random junk, and furniture we never used. The attic was a nightmare. It smelled musty and the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered. When I flipped the switch, I was ready to toss half the stuff, but then I saw those photos. They were stacked against the far wall, hidden behind some battered suitcases. At first I thought maybe they were family heirlooms I'd never heard about, but when I looked closer I realized the people in the pictures were total strangers. The pictures were all black and white. The people wore clothes that seemed old-fashioned, like something from the middle of the last century. There were men, women, a few teenagers, but I didn't recognize a single face. Each photograph was in its own simple frame. All the people looked tense with rigid shoulders and tight expressions. Some had eyes that seemed fixed on the camera, like they were bracing for something. Others had their gaze shifted to the side. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck as I flipped through them. I couldn't explain why. Something about their faces made me uneasy. I set the first few frames aside, then realized there were more stacks of them, dozens. I wondered who had put them there and why. This house belonged to my great uncle before he passed it on. He never mentioned anything like this. I took a few of the frames to the nearest table under the attic light. I tried to see if there were dates or names written on the back. Nothing, all blank. The frames were dusty and my hands got covered in a fine layer of dirt. When I picked them up, I felt a chill in the air that wasn't just about the weather. It made the hair on my arms stand on end. I should have just closed the boxes and taken everything downstairs to get rid of, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to hang some of them on a spare section of attic wall. I wanted to examine them more closely. Maybe I thought I could see some detail that would give me a clue about their identity. Maybe I'd recognize a place or a name on a sign in the background. So I found an old hammer and some nails in the corner. I put 4 or 5 frames up on a clear spot by the attic door. Then I stepped back to get a good look. The people in the photos looked like they were staring right back at me. Their eyes, though faded, still had an intensity that made my stomach tighten. I finished for the day. After hanging those few pictures, I stacked the other frames neatly in a corner and headed downstairs. My partner was in the living room sorting books. She asked me how it. When I said it was fine, just dusty, I decided not to say anything about the photos yet. I wasn't sure how to explain the feeling I got from them. It wasn't anything I could articulate, so I kept it to myself. That night I went to bed late. I had trouble sleeping, so I spent an hour lying in the dark. My mind kept drifting to those pictures, wondering who the people were. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, but I couldn't. Eventually I dozed off. Around 3 o'clock in the morning I woke up to a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was just the house settling. Old wood can make weird noises, but the tapping persisted. It sounded like footsteps above my head. I leaned over, looked at the clock, and rubbed my eyes. My heart started to pound, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I stayed in bed, listened a little longer, and decided I must be imagining it. The next morning I went up to the attic to continue the cleanup. The first thing I noticed was that the pictures weren't in the same configuration. I remembered I had hung them in a neat row, but now they seemed a bit tilted. One was off center, as if it had been nudged. I looked around to see if maybe there was a strong draft or something that could have caused it, but the windows were sealed shut. The dust on the floor didn't look disturbed. I shrugged it off, straightened them, and continued with my work. I spent most of that day reorganizing boxes. I occasionally looked at the photos on the wall. Something seemed different about them. Every time I glanced over, I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe the angles of their faces looked off, or maybe the shadows were playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore the feeling. Then right before lunch I swore one of the pictures was crooked again. The top edge was leaning away from The wall, I walked over to fix it while I reached out to straighten the frame. I felt a rush of cold air across my back. I spun around but nothing was there. When I told my partner about the frames, she said I should stop overthinking. She figured they were probably just loose on the nails. She offered to help me move them downstairs if they were bothering me. I said I wanted to keep them up there a bit longer just to see if I could figure out who these people were. She shrugged and let me do my thing. I guess she could see I was a little fixated that night. I decided to check the attic before going to bed. I wanted to make sure nothing was out of place. I grabbed a flashlight and headed up the stairs. When I turned on the attic light, the pictures looked normal at first, but as I walked closer, I noticed their faces. They seemed different. The tension was still there, but some of them looked almost pleading now, like they wanted something from me. My heart started thumping faster. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was reading too much into a bunch of old black and white photos. I shut off the light and started to leave. That's when I heard something scrape along the floor behind me. It was a short, sharp noise like a frame being dragged. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. I shone the beam across the floorboards. All the pictures were still on the wall, so I couldn't figure out what made the sound. I stood there for a while just breathing hard. I looked around the attic, but everything else seemed the same. Eventually I forced myself to go back downstairs. My palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the flashlight. The next few days I kept hearing strange noises from the attic. Sometimes it was that tapping sound, other times it was a soft creaking. My partner heard it too, once or twice, but she always dismissed it as the house settling. During the day I'd go back up and I'd swear the frames were in different spots. It wasn't like they were obviously rearranged, but the spacing on the wall looked off, or a picture was slightly higher or lower than before. I kept adjusting them, trying to put them back in the exact position. I remembered every time I looked at those faces they appeared more distressed. Some of their eyes seemed to shift toward me like they were following my movement. I tried to see if there was some trick of perspective. I'd step to the right, then to the left, checking if it was a simple illusion, but it never felt that simple. When I got too close, I felt a chill at the back of my neck again, the same one I felt that first day on the fourth night. I woke up to a loud thump. It came from above my bedroom, right where the attic was. I shot out of bed, grabbed the flashlight again, and crept up the stairs. My heart was racing, my mouth felt dry. I flipped on the attic light and I saw one of the frames lying on the floor. The glass wasn't cracked, but the back panel had come loose and the photo was slightly out of place inside it. I picked it up and checked the wire that was supposed to hold it on the nail. It didn't look damaged. The nail was still firmly in the wall. There was no reason for that picture to be on the floor. While I was holding it, I studied the person in the photo. It was a man with a furrowed brow, eyes locked forward as if he was bracing for impact. I could see a new detail I hadn't noticed before. His tie was slightly askew, like he just rushed into place for the photo. I slipped the picture back into the frame and carefully hung it again. I made sure it was secure, then I stepped away. Listening, the attic was silent now. No wind, no footsteps, just my own breathing. I was too wired to sleep after that. I sat in the living room for about an hour, watching TV on low volume, trying to calm down. My thoughts kept circling back to the frames. Why did they move on their own? Why were the expressions changing? I felt a knot of dread in my gut. I told myself I had to do something, either get rid of them or figure out their origin. The next day I called a friend who knew a bit about photography. I asked if old pictures could change color or wear over time. He said yes, pictures can fade or become warped if exposed to humidity or sunlight, but not in the way I was describing. I didn't mention the moving frames or the footsteps. I just asked general questions. He didn't have any special insight. After hanging up, I went back to the attic. I started pulling more frames out of the boxes, hoping to find clues on the backs or inside the frames. Still nothing, no dates, no names, no text. That afternoon, while my partner was out, I decided to rearrange the pictures on the wall in a different pattern. I thought maybe if I changed the order I'd notice something new. I lined up a dozen of them in a row, then put another 4 or 5 underneath. I stepped back to see the arrangement. Then I realized the people in the bottom row looked like they were angled up as if staring at the row above them. It creeped me out. My pulse was thawing in my ears. I switched some frames around, but it didn't help. No matter how I arranged them, the people in the photos had the same tense, urgent expressions. I felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. That evening I was getting ready for bed when I heard footsteps again. They were slow, deliberate steps crossing the attic floor. I paused at the bottom of the attic ladder, listening. My scalp prickled. I called out, "Hello," no answer. The steps stopped saying. I climbed up with my flashlight, flipped on the overhead light. I saw that a few frames were now leaning against the wall. On the floor there were no signs that the nails had come loose. I picked one up. The man in the photo had his eyes turned slightly to the left as if looking at someone just out of frame. I set it back on the wall, my hands shaking. I decided I couldn't handle this anymore. Something was off. I grabbed a cardboard box and started taking the frames off the wall one by one. As I carried them, my stomach churned. I felt this unsettling urge to put them back, like some part of the attic wanted them to stay on display, but I kept packing Them into the box. I only left one picture on the wall by accident because I ran out of space in the box. I almost didn't notice, but it was hanging right by the door. It showed a woman with wide eyes and clenched fists. Once I sealed the box, I hurried downstairs. I put it in a storage room off the garage. I figured I'd deal with them later, maybe contact someone who knew antiques or old photos. Then I went up to bed. I managed to fall asleep after a while, relieved that I'd taken them down. Sometime in the early morning, I woke up again to a loud scraping noise from the attic. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. My chest tightened. My throat felt dry. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or some random old house noise, but it didn't stop. It went on for a few minutes, then ended with a solid thump. I stayed in bed staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the single frame I left behind had fallen, or maybe the entire stack of boxes had been knocked over. But why? By what I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning. I pulled the covers up, closed my eyes, and tried to shut everything out. Now I'm sitting here in the living room telling you this story because I'm still on edge. The attic is quiet at the moment, but I can't relax. I feel like the silence is waiting to be broken again. My partner thinks I should just get someone to haul everything away, maybe call a contractor to check for rotten beams or anything that could cause movement. I might do that, but a part of me feels that I need to understand what's going on. I don't know if I ever will. All I know is that there's something disturbing about those photos. It's not just the way they look or the fact that they keep moving. It's the feeling I get when I near them, like they're a window into something I don't want to see. For now, they're locked in that storage room, but I keep wondering if that's enough, because every night I hear those footsteps and I can't figure out how to make them stop. And in the morning I keep expecting to find the attic door open and those frames set back on the wall staring at me again, and that's the part that keeps me awake at night. I found that notebook in an old drawer on a Saturday evening. I had gone to my family's house to sort through a bunch of stuff nobody wanted. The house had a stale smell, like it hadn't been aired out in months. When I pulled open that drawer, I only expected to see dust, maybe some random papers. Instead, there was this small leather-bound notebook. It looked ordinary on the outside except for a few scratches on the cover. No words, no initial, just blank leather. I flipped through the pages and saw nothing written anywhere. It looked unused. I tossed it on the kitchen table without a second thought. At that point I didn't sense anything weird. I just thought I'd keep it as a curiosity and maybe write down some notes. That was my plan, but it didn't last long. I heard an odd scraping sound. Later that night, when I was alone in the living room, the house was quiet apart from the hum of the refrigerator. I got up to check the kitchen, but everything looked the same except for the notebook. It was still lying there, but the cover looked slightly open. I brushed my hand across it. The leather felt cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. When I picked it up, I noticed a faint mark on the first page. It looked like a pencil line, but I hadn't written anything. I closed it, thinking it was probably just a smudge. I set it back down and went upstairs to my old bedroom. I didn't feel uneasy yet. I just found it odd. Around midnight, a dull thump echoed from downstairs. My heart jolted. I had been trying to sleep on an old mattress that creaked every time I shifted. I thought maybe something had fallen off the counter. I got up, rubbed my eyes, and walked down the stairs. My pulse sped up when I saw the notebook on the floor about 2 feet away from the table. The cover was flipped open and I saw something written on the first page. It looked like messy handwriting, the letters dark and uneven. I picked it up and felt my stomach tighten. It read, "I watch in the dark." That was all. The ink or whatever it was looked fresh, like it had just dried. I couldn't come up with an explanation. I hadn't written it. Nobody else was in the house. My immediate thought was to toss the notebook in the trash, but part of me wanted to understand what was going on. I closed the notebook and pressed the cover firmly. My hands were shaking a little, so I forced myself to take a few slow breaths. I put it back on the table and stared at it for a while. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise, like someone was standing behind me. I turned around, but the kitchen was empty. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing except the refrigerator hum. Finally, I decided to go back upstairs. I left the lights on. I didn't sleep well that night. Whenever I closed my eyes, I heard faint scratching like a pencil on paper. I jump up, look around, and see nothing. The room was dark, and the only thing I could hear was my own breathing. My chest felt tight, and I kept imagining something crouched in the corner. At one point I thought I heard the bedroom door creak, so I sat up and switched on the lamp. The door was shut just as I'd left it. After a few minutes of tense silence, I managed to drift off again. I woke up at dawn with sweat on my forehead. I went downstairs and found the notebook still on the table, closed. I tried to open it, but the pages were blank again. The sentence I'd seen last night was gone. I slid my finger across the page where I'd seen those words, but it was smooth. There was no sign of fresh ink, no smudge, nothing. I felt lightheaded. I told myself I must have been half asleep. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. I put it in a drawer and decided to step outside for some fresh air. That afternoon I heard creaking noises near the living room closet. It sounded like someone was pushing against the door from the inside. I opened it and there was nothing unusual, just coats and a few boxes. Then I heard a loud slam from the hallway. When I reached the hallway I found the window had shut itself. There was no wind outside and I'd left it open on purpose. To let some air in. My body tensed and I had this tight feeling in my chest again. I had the impression I wasn't alone in the house. My eyes kept darting around, expecting to see a shape or a figure, but every room looked empty. The floorboards were silent as I walked around. Later that evening I decided to take another look at the notebook. I sat in the living room with a small table lamp on. The overhead light was flickering occasionally, which made my nerves worse. I opened the drawer and pulled out the notebook. As soon as I touched it I noticed the pages felt different, thicker. Somehow I flipped through them and I saw new marks scattered across random pages. Some were strange symbols, some looked like short phrases in a language I didn't recognize. Others were lines drawn in black ink. They reminded me of small shapes or maybe eyes. I felt the hair on my arms stand up and my mouth went dry. There was a low rumble from the ceiling, like wood settling. I closed the notebook because I couldn't handle looking at it anymore. About an hour later I heard something clattering in the kitchen. I found a cabinet door hanging open. Several plates were on the floor, not broken, just lying there. A few cups had rolled off to the side. I took a step back and gripped the counter until my hand hurt. That's when I noticed the notebook was on the counter. Even though I'd left it in the living room, I had no memory of bringing it there. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my chest felt like it was shrinking. I picked it up and opened it again. This time I saw a short message: come to the stairs. My fingertips tingled and I felt a dull ache in my head. I wanted to ignore it, but I found myself walking toward the staircase. The stairway was dark because I hadn't turned on the overhead light. I could see the faint outline of each step. I stood at the bottom listening. The house felt too quiet. There was a thick silence that made my ears ring. I took one step, then another, holding the notebook against my chest. The steps creaked under my weight. I had this strong feeling that something was at the top waiting for me, but I couldn't stop. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I reached the top, the hallway light flickered. The door to the room where I'd slept was ajar. A cold draft hit me and I shivered. I felt a sharp sting in my eyes, like I hadn't blinked in too long. I heard something shift in the darkness up ahead, said maybe a piece of furniture or a footstep. I called out, but my voice came out strained and weak. Nobody answered. I stepped into the room, switched on the light, and found it empty. The sheets on the bed were rubbed and the closet door was half open. I checked inside. There was nothing there, but the air felt heavy, like I was breathing through cloth. Back in the hallway I opened the notebook one more time. The symbols on the page AGS looked even clearer. Some lines formed shapes that seemed to shift as I stared at them. I rubbed my eyes thinking maybe I was just tired. Then I heard a soft scraping noise near the attic hatch. My skin tingled all over. The hatch was above me. I glanced up and saw the thin door in the ceiling I rarely went into the attic, and I had no reason to go there now, yet the sound continued like nails scratching against wood. I climbed onto a chair and pushed the hatch open with a broom handle. A weak light bulb in the attic revealed dusty boxes and old suitcases. As I raised myself up I noticed the notebook felt warmer. It was almost hot in my hand. I rested the notebook on the attic floor and climbed up fully. My jeans caught on a splinter and I nearly lost my balance. I managed to stand, scanning the area. I heard a faint whisper, but it didn't form any clear words. It felt like air moving past my ear. I crouched and opened the notebook again, flipping to the last page. Now there was another sentence: you are close. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. I set the notebook down and looked around. A single beam of light from the bare bulb showed me corners filled with dust and spiderwebs. There was a mirror covered by a sheet. I pulled the sheet off. My reflection looked pale and tense. The scrapes on the leather cover of the notebook were visible in the mirror. For some reason I felt like the reflection wasn't matching my movements exactly, but that might have been my nerves. I blinked and turned around quickly, expecting to see something behind me. There was nothing, just the same boxes. I picked up the notebook, climbed down and closed the hatch. My heart was still pounding and I could feel my pulse in my throat. I headed back to the living room, trying to calm down. I opened all the windows to let in some fresh air. The sun was setting, which made the house feel dim and shadowy. I sat on the couch with the notebook in my lap. I had to decide whether to destroy it or keep going. I thought about throwing it into the fireplace, but I wanted answers. I wanted to see if there was something else written. I told myself I'd give it one more night. If things got worse, I'd get rid of it. In the morning, as darkness fell, the house started making more noises. Floorboards popped in different rooms, doors creaked, then went silent. At one point I heard the rattling of a window in the upstairs bathroom. I felt cold sweat drip down my sides. I got up to check, but as I reached the second floor the sound stopped. The bathroom window was shut tight. I switched on the hallway light and noticed flickers again. The bulb seemed fine though, so I wasn't sure why it kept doing that. When I walked back down I found the notebook open on the living room table. I didn't remember leaving it open. My throat went dry and I felt my heart thud on the page in large black letters. It said, "The truth is under the drawer." My mind flashed back to that desk drawer where I'd found the notebook. I felt a surge of adrenaline. My hands felt clammy. But I had to look. I walked over to the desk, yanked the drawer out and placed it. On the floor, the space behind the drawer was dusty. My hands trembled as I reached in and felt around. My fingertips brushed something thin and rectangular. I pulled it out. It was a photograph. It showed my father standing in that very room holding a similar notebook. I flipped the photo over. On the back there was a date from 30 years ago. My father never mentioned anything about a strange notebook, but there he was staring straight at the camera with a grim expression. I felt uneasy, like my stomach was churning. I put the photo on the desk and looked at the notebook. The pages were fluttering on their own, even though there was no breeze. My pulse hammered. I saw words forming again. He knew. At that moment I realized my father must have encountered the same weird phenomena, but he never spoke about it. Did he find a way to seal it away? Did he leave it here on purpose? My eyes started to water and I took a few steps back. My hands were shaking and I almost dropped the notebook. The air in the room felt thick. My mouth tasted metallic. I heard a faint dragging noise near the front door. The doorknob rattled. I expected it to open, but it stayed shut. The tension built in my chest until I could barely inhale. I gripped the notebook with both hands and held it over the trash can. My arms were trembling and my mind was racing. If I threw it away, would that stop whatever was happening, or would it get worse? My breathing was rapid and shallow. I closed my eyes for a second, then looked at the notebook again. The words had changed. Don't. My heart felt like it skipped a beat. I let out a shaky breath and lowered my arms. Something compelled me to keep the notebook. I needed to understand more. I flipped through the pages and my vision blurred for a moment. When it cleared, I saw dark corridors in my mind. Like a vivid daydream, I saw long shadows on the walls. The corridors were narrow and seemed to stretch on forever. My ears rang and my heart raced. Then the vision vanished and I was back in the living room, gripping the notebook so hard my knuckles went white. My shirt was damp with sweat. My muscles were tense, and so I slammed the notebook shut and locked it in a small chest in the corner of the room. I felt the weight of fear pressing down on me. I could hear the floor creaking again, as if the house was breathing. My head pounded. I needed a moment to think. I decided to sit down at the kitchen table and focus on the present. The walls seemed to press in and the windows rattled. My legs were shaky and my palms were sweaty, but I just sat there, breathing in and out. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Minutes passed. There were no new noises. Eventually I stood up and checked the chest. Everything was quiet. The notebook stayed inside. I don't know if I'll destroy it or hold on to it for a while longer, but I can't deny what I've seen or heard. The house reacts when the notebook changes. Doors slam, windows rattle, the attic hatch creaks, and unseen shapes move around. I feel torn about what to do next. My gut tells me that if I open it again, I'll see even darker things, but I also want to learn what my father knew. For now I'm keeping it locked away, hoping it stays silent until I decide. I can still feel that cold weight in my chest. Part of me wants to end this and part of me can't walk away. I'm stuck with this notebook that shows me things I can't ignore. I guess I'll have to find the truth on my own terms. Until then I'm staying alert and keeping the lights on. I arrived at the old convent on a Monday afternoon. The paint on the walls was cracked, the floorboards were uneven, and the air smelled like damp stone. I had a truck parked outside with all my tools. I wanted to get this job done fast, because I needed to move my supplies into this space. By the end of the month my plan was to transform the old place into a functional atelier. I didn't expect anything unusual. I just wanted to fix up the walls, give everything a fresh coat of paint, and set up my work area. The first thing I did was take a slow walk through each corridor. The building used to be a convent, so it had high ceilings, thick walls, and tiny rooms that had once been cells for the nuns. The windows were narrow, letting in limited light. There was a heavy, silent atmosphere inside. My footsteps echoed in these long halls, and sometimes when I stopped the echo would keep going for a split second longer than I expected. It made me feel a little uneasy, like there was someone else there, matching my steps. I shrugged it off as the way old buildings carry sound. I started by cleaning up the walls. I set up a step ladder, grabbed some sandpaper, and spent hours trying to smooth out the layers of old paint. Dust floated through the air, making me cough every time I ran the sandpaper over the walls. I heard faint scratching that reminded me of nails on a chalkboard. I didn't think much of it at first. Old plaster makes all kinds of sounds when you work on it. After about an hour I noticed odd phrases near the top of one wall. At first I thought it was just some scribbles. I leaned in with a flashlight because the overhead bulbs were weak. There were letters in dark ink, arranged in rows. They looked like scrambled words, maybe codes or some kind of secret writing. I tried to read them, but they made no sense. I took a closer look and saw a name underneath each set of phrases. It was like a signature, but the letters were too faded to read clearly. I figured it was old graffiti. Maybe people who lived here after it stopped functioning as a convent had left behind cryptic marks. I kept sanding, trying to erase these words. Each pass of the sandpaper made them fainter until they were hardly visible. Then I applied a fresh coat of primer. It was thick and I spread it over the wall carefully, checking to make sure I covered every inch. By the time I finished that wall I felt a chill along my spine. I thought it Was just the cold air seeping in through the cracks in the walls. My back was tired and my arms ached from all the sanding. I turned off the lights, locked up, and drove home. The next morning I came back ready to continue. I set my coffee down on a folding table near the entrance. My eyes were still half closed. From lack of sleep I yawned, walked into the main corridor and stopped in my tracks. The wall I had primed was full of those same lines of text, only they looked darker and clearer than before. The words seemed almost fresh, like they had been written that same morning. The signatures were also visible. Some had different handwriting styles. I stood there confused because I had covered that entire area thoroughly. There was no way the old marks could have bled through that much paint overnight. It was impossible. I approached the wall, touched it, and felt that the paint was fully dry. I rubbed my fingers along the text. No paint came off on my hand. The letters looked like new ink. I felt a knot in my stomach. I tried to tell myself it was just some chemical reaction from the older layers of paint. I figured I could cover it again and move on. I applied a second coat, even thicker than before. I spent half the day on that wall, determined to make sure the ink or whatever it was didn't show through again. By late afternoon it looked spotless. I exhaled in relief, did a quick cleanup, and went home, ignoring a persistent feeling of unease. The third day I walked in and saw the writing again. This time there were new signatures. The phrases were still scrambled, but I made out the words passages, and beneath in one line another line said, "The halls carry shadows." I felt my stomach churn. I cursed under my breath and ran my hand along the wall again. The paint was dry and the text was right there, bold and clear. I felt a cold draft behind me. I turned around fast, expecting to see a window open or a door ajar. Everything was shut. My heart thumped and my hands felt clammy. I thought about leaving the job, but I had a contract to finish. I told myself I'd find a logical reason for this. Maybe the paint was cheap, or maybe the primer wasn't bonding right. I took a break to get fresh air. I walked through the side corridor to the open courtyard. The courtyard was small, with old stone walls that rose high and blocked most of the sunlight. I ran my fingers along the stone, feeling the cracks in the cold surface. Suddenly I heard faint footsteps behind me, like someone was trying not to be noticed. I spun around. No one was there. The sound faded as soon as I turned. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. My heart pounded hard. The place seemed too silent for a busy street. Just a few blocks away I could still hear distant traffic outside, but inside the convent it felt like a sealed-off world. I forced myself to continue the renovation. I moved on to another hallway to see if the same thing would happen there. I used an industrial sander on the plaster and the machine roared in my hands. Clouds of dust filled the air, making me cough again. As the dust settled I saw faint outlines of text along the edges of the second corridor. The letters looked similar to the ones in the main hall. I noticed a signature that read something like Brother Thomas, but the letters were smudged. I used a rag with paint thinner to wipe it off. The letters faded, but after a few seconds they seemed to reappear as if they were seeping out from inside the wall. I felt dizzy. I braced myself against the sander and tried to steady my breathing. That evening I tried a different approach. I used a special sealant on that corridor before painting. The sealant smelled strong, almost suffocating. I had to wear a mask and keep the windows open. My eyes burned from the chemicals. As I applied the sealant I noticed the writing shimmer in the light. For a moment the text seemed to pulse, like it was resisting me. I finished up, locked the building, and left quickly. Driving home I couldn't shake the image of the writing burning through every coat of paint. I felt silly for being so rattled, but I couldn't deny how nervous I felt. The fourth morning I stepped inside and immediately felt a drop in temperature. The interior felt at least 10 degrees colder than outside. My breath formed a faint mist in front of my mouth. I walked over to the walls I had sealed, and sure enough the writing was there. Again, crisp and fresh. The paint was dripping in some spots, creating small rivulets that ran across the phrases. It looked like tears on the walls. I reached out and the paint wasn't wet. My fingertips stayed clean, but the drips were visible, moving so slowly that I had to stare for a few seconds to be sure. My hands shook and my heartbeat felt too fast. My throat went dry. I backed away and bumped into a shelf. Tools clattered onto the floor. I heard footsteps again, this time echoing in the hall next to mine. They were light steps, like someone in soft shoes. I walked toward the noise, my knees shaking. I looked around each corner, expecting to see a person. There was no one. The footsteps stopped when I got close. I tried to call out, "Hello." My voice sounded loud in the quiet, but there was no reply. A door hinge squeaked somewhere behind me. I turned around fast, but I only saw a closed door. My heart felt like it was climbing up my throat. I was sweating even though the air was cold. I decided to open every door in the building one by one. I wanted to clear each room to be sure I was alone. Most of the rooms were empty, just small cells with stone floors and dusty windows. Some had old tables or chairs stacked against the walls, covered with sheets. Nothing looked out of place except for a few more lines of that strange writing always near the walls. I touched them and my fingers tingled like a mild electric shock. I pulled my hand away fast. I felt goosebumps forming on my arms and neck. The more I looked around, the more I found these Markings they appeared in corners behind shelves, even along the floor near the baseboard. Some were only a few words. Others were several lines. Each signature looked different. Some had formal handwriting, others were almost scribbles. Most were in what looked like old ink, but a few had a more modern look, as if written with a common marker. The references to secret passages were consistent. I kept seeing the words hidden corridor below the chapel under the flagstones, or open at dusk. Every time I saw something new, my breathing sped up and my stomach felt tight. That afternoon I was working in the former chapel area, sweeping out the debris. The tall windows fell in weak light, and I saw dust motes floating in the air. I heard a soft scraping noise behind the altar. I walked over, shining my flashlight on the stone floor. There was a small crack about the width of my finger running across the floor. It looked like the stone slab had been moved or pry open. At some point I knelt down and tried to get the slab to move, but it felt stuck. The scraping noise continued, like something was shifting underneath, but I couldn't see any opening. My flashlight flickered, and my pulse pounded in my ears. Suddenly I felt a wave of cold air brush past my neck. I jerked back. My flashlight beam trembled as I turned around to see who was behind me, but no one was there. The scraping noise stopped. I got to my feet and backed away, feeling dizzy. My hands shook, my chest felt tight. I tried to steady my breathing. My mind raced with questions. I had no logical explanation for these things. I just wanted to get out of there, but I also wanted to finish the job my livelihood depended on. Completing this renovation, I had no intention of telling anyone about these odd events. I didn't want to sound like I was losing my mind. I tried to focus on practical tasks. I hammered new nails into some loose floorboards. I tightened hinges on old doors. I replaced a few broken light fixtures. All the while I felt a presence behind me, like someone was watching. Whenever I turned around, I saw empty corridors. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get a full breath. Sweat soaked the back of my shirt, even though the air was cold. Whenever my hammer struck a nail, the echo lingered a moment too long, making me flinch. By dusk I decided to check on the main corridor again. The new paint on the walls had started to drip in thin lines, forming fresh rivulets that outlined more words. I read one that said, "It waits below." Another read, "Do not stay after dark." My hands trembled as I held the flashlight. The beam shook against the wall. I felt a dull ache in my gut. I heard the footsteps again behind me. This time they sounded closer. I turned around, my heart pounding, but the corridor was empty. My palms felt wet with sweat. My whole body felt tense, as if ready for a fight. Then I heard a soft whisper. It sounded like many voices speaking at once, but I couldn't make out the words. They were too faint. The voices seemed to come from the walls themselves. I pressed my ear to the wall, and I felt a vibration, like something was moving inside. I jumped back, startled. My head spun with worry. I had no proof that anyone was there, but I felt eyes on me everywhere. When I glanced at my watch, it was almost completely dark. Outside, the overhead lights flickered for a moment, then stabilized. My whole body felt like it was pulsing with adrenaline. I rushed to gather my tools and shut everything down for the night. I locked the front door, then tried the handle 3 times to make sure it was secure. In the silence of the deserted street, I could still hear those footsteps in my head. I felt a chill that wouldn't go away, like I was trapped in a cold wind that no one else could feel. My shoulders were stiff and my lower back felt twisted. It was pure tension. I stood outside, staring at the tall, dark silhouette of the old convent. The windows looked like empty eyes. I couldn't believe that walls could bleed writing like that, or that footsteps could echo without a person to make them, but it was happening, and I had to face it. Tomorrow I would have to come back. I would try a different brand of primer, or strip the plaster off completely. I would do anything to get rid of those words. I didn't know who was writing them or how they appeared. All I knew was that once the sun went down, the sense of unease grew stronger. Something was in there. Something was watching me. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck and sat there for a moment. My heart was still racing. My hands shook so much that I dropped my keys twice before I managed to start the engine. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second I thought I saw a figure in one of the upstairs windows. It was a shape, dark and still. I blinked and it was gone. My hands felt cold on the wheel. I drove off, wishing I could forget what I'd seen, but knowing I would dream about it tomorrow. I'd have to face it again. I remember the exact moment I first saw that harp in my attic. I was moving boxes around, trying to find a broken chair I wanted to fix. I pulled some old quilts from a corner and caught a glimpse of something large under a dirty sheet. When I lifted the cloth, I saw the harp. It stood upright, surrounded by dust, with intricate wooden details carved into its column and base. It had thick strings coated in cobwebs. I felt a strong urge to wipe it clean and see if it made any sound at all. My heart pounded and I tasted dust on my tongue. I was alone in the attic, and the single light bulb overhead made everything feel dim. I ran my fingers over the strings. They were stiff, but they vibrated under my touch. That vibration stayed with me longer than it should have. My hands felt a strange tingle. I dragged the harp out into the open, almost knocking into a wobbly desk on my left. The floor creaked as I moved. The harp felt heavier than I expected, and I had to strain my back to push it across the wooden boards. The dust got into my nose and I sneezed. I tried not to breathe too deeply, but I couldn't help it once I sat it near a window. I opened the shutters to let more light in. The sunlight showed every scratch, every worn spot on the wood. I thought it looked old and expensive, even though it had obviously been abandoned for a long time later. That evening I brought the harp downstairs because I wanted to examine it in better light. I turned on the lamp in the living room, placed the harp by the fireplace, and sat on a stool to see if any of the strings worked. At first I plucked them in a random order. They were out of tune and made dull sounds. My fingers felt uncertain. I'd never played a harp before, only a little piano. As a child I kept fiddling with the strings until my fingers felt numb. The night grew quiet and my eyelids got heavy. I decided to leave the harp where it was and go to bed. I switched off the lights and tried to get some rest. Around 3 o'clock in the morning I woke up to a low humming vibration. My heart thumped and a chill shot through my body. At first I thought a truck was driving by, or maybe there was thunder in the distance. Then I heard a brief series of notes. It was soft but distinct. I sat up in bed, my back tensed and my ears strained to catch every sound. I recognized the tone from the harp. It was in the living room. I got out of bed and slowly walked toward the hallway. My feet felt cold against the floor. I didn't turn on the lights because I was focused on that noise. I heard another set of chords, then silence. I stood by the living room door, peering in. The fireplace was off. The moonlight came through the window and I could see the harp's silhouette. It stood still, but it felt different, as if it held some charge in the air around it. I flipped the light switch. Everything looked normal. I walked over to the harp. The strings weren't moving and there was no breeze in the room. My hands felt sweaty and my pulse was fast. I whispered to myself that maybe I had dreamed it. I stayed there for a few minutes, but nothing else happened. I returned to bed, though I couldn't sleep well. My thoughts stayed on that harp. The next day I tried to tune the harp. I didn't know the correct method, so I watched some quick video tutorials on my phone. I found a small tuning key in the attic, probably left there by whoever owned the harp before me. I adjusted each string carefully. It took me a while because the harp was old and the pegs were stiff. My arms got tired, but eventually I got most of the strings to produce a decent pitch. The sound was more pleasant now. I tried to play a few simple scales, but my technique was clumsy. My fingers slipped on the strings. Still, I liked the resonant quality it had. That night I heard it again. This time the notes were longer, forming a slow sequence. I jolted awake from a deep sleep, my ears instantly on alert. My heart beat so hard it felt like a hammer inside my chest. I didn't wait. I threw off my blankets and walked straight to the living room. I turned the corner and saw the harp. The air felt charged like static. I heard a faint echo of the last note fading out. My arms broke into goosebumps and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned on the lamp. The harp looked the same as always, but I saw a slight shimmer on one of the strings, like it had just been plucked. I reached out and touched it. It was still vibrating. That moment made my stomach turn. I stood there staring, unsure what to do. Then I grabbed a notebook and started writing down the notes as best I could. I tried to match each tone on my phone's piano app. My hands took while I wrote. I felt compelled to record everything I could. Maybe I thought it would help me understand what was happening. The next day I tried to replicate those sequences on the harp. I struggled to match the exact pattern, but I caught some resemblance of the chords. They were slow and had a somber feeling as I played them. Something inside me tingled. My breathing got shallow and I had a sense of being watched. That night I had a dream that felt incredibly real. I saw a large ballroom with polished floors. There were people in formal attire dancing and talking. I stood in a corner watching them. Their clothes were from another era: tailcoats, long dresses, and gloves. I heard harp music echoing through the room, but I couldn't see who was playing. When I woke up I was drenched in sweat. My sheets were twisted around my legs. My heart was racing. I sat up in bed panting. I took a long drink of water and tried to calm down. The IM wouldn't leave my head. Over the following nights the harp played on its own more frequently. Sometimes it was a single chord, other times a short melody. I got up each time and wrote the notes in my notebook. I tried to keep track of the time as well. It always happened between 2 and 4 in the morning. My tiredness grew. I started feeling restless during the day. My hands trembled whenever I thought about the harp. I stopped going out with friends. I wanted to stay near the harp to see if anything else would happen. I began attempting to learn more complex pieces even though I had no music sheets for the harp. I used the internet to find random harp compositions, but none matched the notes I was hearing at night. Then something else happened. While I was practicing a simple tune in the late afternoon, I noticed faint writing on the wood near the top of the harp's column. It looked like old markings partially erased by time. I leaned in closer, but I couldn't read them. They seemed like symbols, maybe part of an original decoration. I felt an odd pull, like the harp wanted me to see those markings. I tried rubbing a pencil over paper laid against the wood to see if I could catch an outline, but it wasn't clear. The writing stayed mostly hidden. I gave up and went back to practicing. That night around 3 o'clock in the morning I woke up to a longer melody. It was fluid and had an unusual pattern. I rushed to the living room. The notes kept Playing one after another like a trained musician's performance, the sound was clear and confident. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the harp strings move without any visible hand touching them. They quivered. In the faint glow of a street light through the window, I felt cold sweat trickle down my forehead. My shirt clung to my back. The melody lasted almost a minute. When it ended, I wrote down what I heard. My handwriting came out shaky. I felt dizzy. After that performance, I began having more detailed dreams. I saw the same ballroom, but now I walked through it. I smelled perfume and cologne. I heard the distinct tapping of shoes on the floor. I noticed that no one acknowledged me, as if I wasn't really there. I kept hearing that harp melody in the distance. My own breathing felt tight in the dream. The dream ended when I tried to approach a man wearing a dark suit. He turned to me with a blank face. I woke up gasping. I didn't feel rested at all. My sheets were soaked with sweat. Again, I decided I wanted to capture every note of that longer melody. I spent the next day replaying what I had jotted down, trying to piece it together. Sometimes my mind went blank and I couldn't recall certain parts. One got frustrated. My frustration led me to become more aggressive in my practice. My fingertips hurt from plucking the strings over and over. My lower back ached from sitting in the same position. I didn't care. I felt like I had to learn this piece. I convinced myself it was a puzzle, and if I solved it, I'd understand why these dreams and midnight concerts kept happening. My obsession grew. I neglected chores. I barely ate. When I did eat, I stood in the kitchen with a sandwich in one hand and my notebook in the other, scribbling notes. I tripped over furniture because I was always distracted thinking about the sequence of chords. My eyes felt heavy from lack of sleep. My neck tensed up so much that it hurt to turn my head. I spent hours on the floor near the harp, searching for hidden compartments or more markings. I tapped the wood, listening for hollow spaces. I found none. On the fourth night of hearing the full melody, I managed to play a decent version of it during the day. As soon as I finished, I felt an intense need to look at the markings again. I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the top of the harp near the place I saw the faint symbols. This time I could make out some letters. They looked like an old language. I couldn't read them, but I recognized that they were there. My mouth went dry. A wave of dizziness came over me. I steadied myself by leaning on the harp. The wood felt warm, almost like it had its own heat. My pulse quickened again. My hand and trembled. That night the harp did not play by itself. I stayed awake, waiting in the living room. My eyes were on the harp strings, expecting them to move. Nothing happened. Around 4:30 in the morning, I finally dozed off on the couch. I dreamed again of that ballroom. This time I stood at the center of the dance floor. The music was coming from out and touched it. It was still vibrating. That moment made my stomach turn. I stood there staring, unsure what to do. Then I grabbed a notebook and started writing down the notes as best I could. I tried to match each tone on my phone's piano app. My hands took while I wrote. I felt compelled to record everything I could. Maybe I thought it would help me understand what was happening. The next day I tried to replicate those sequences on the harp. I struggled to match the exact pattern, but I caught some resemblance of the chords. They were slow and had a somber feeling as I played them. Something inside me tingled. My breathing got shallow and I had a sense of being watched. That night I had a dream that felt incredibly real. I saw a large ballroom with polished floors. There were people in formal attire dancing and talking. I stood in a corner watching them. Their clothes were from another era: tailcoats, long dresses, and gloves. I heard harp music echoing through the room, but I couldn't see who was playing. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat. My sheets were twisted around my legs. My heart was racing. I sat up in bed, panting. I took a long drink of water and tried to calm down. The IM wouldn't leave my head. Over the following nights, the harp played on its own more frequently. Sometimes it was a single chord, other times a short melody. I got up each time and wrote the notes in my notebook. I tried to keep track of the time as well. It always happened between 2 and 4 in the morning. My tiredness grew. I started feeling restless during the day. My hands trembled whenever I thought about the harp. I stopped going out with friends. I wanted to stay near the harp to see if anything else would happen. I began attempting to learn more complex pieces even though I had no music sheets for the harp. I used the internet to find random harp compositions, but none matched the notes I was hearing at night. Then something else happened. While I was practicing a simple tune in the late afternoon, I noticed faint writing on the wood near the top of the harp's column. It looked like old markings partially erased by time. I leaned in closer, but I couldn't read them. They seemed like symbols, maybe part of an original decoration. I felt an odd pull, like the harp wanted me to see those markings. I tried rubbing a pencil over paper laid against the wood to see if I could catch an outline, but it wasn't clear. The writing stayed mostly hidden. I gave up and went back to practicing. That night around 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to a longer melody. It was fluid and had an unusual pattern. I rushed to the living room. The notes kept playing one after another like a trained musician's performance. The sound was clear and confident. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the harp strings move without any visible hand touching them. They quivered. In the faint glow of a street light through the window, I felt cold sweat trickle down my forehead. My shirt clung To my back the melody lasted almost a minute. When it ended I wrote down what I heard. My handwriting came out shaky. I felt dizzy. After that performance I began having more detailed dreams. I saw the same ballroom, but now I walked through it. I smelled perfume and cologne. I heard the distinct tapping of shoes on the floor. I noticed that no one acknowledged me, as if I wasn't really there. I kept hearing that harp melody in the distance. My own breathing felt tight in the dream. The dream ended when I tried to approach a man wearing a dark suit. He turned to me with a blank face. I woke up gasping. I didn't feel rested at all. My sheets were soaked with sweat again. I decided I wanted to capture every note of that longer melody. I spent the next day replaying what I had jotted down, trying to piece it together. Sometimes my mind went blank and I couldn't recall certain parts. One got frustrated. My frustration led me to become more aggressive in my practice. My fingertips hurt from plucking the strings over and over. My lower back ached from sitting in the same position. I didn't care. I felt like I had to learn this piece. I convinced myself it was a puzzle, and if I solved it I'd understand why these dreams and midnight concerts kept happening. My obsession grew. I neglected chores. I barely ate. When I did eat, I stood in the kitchen with a sandwich in one hand and my notebook in the other, scribbling notes. I tripped over furniture because I was always distracted thinking about the sequence of chords. My eyes felt heavy from lack of sleep. My neck tensed up so much that it hurt to turn my head. I spent hours on the floor near the harp, searching for hidden compartments or more markings. I tapped the wood, listening for hollow spaces. I found none. On the fourth night of hearing the full melody, I managed to play a decent version of it during the day. As soon as I finished, I felt an intense need to look at the markings again. I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the top of the harp near the place I saw the faint symbols. This time I could make out some letters. They looked like an old language. I couldn't read them, but I recognized that they were there. My mouth went dry. A wave of dizziness came over me. I steadied myself by leaning on the harp. The wood felt warm, almost like it had its own heat. My pulse quickened again. My hand and trembled. That night the harp did not play by itself. I stayed awake, waiting in the living room. My eyes were on the harp strings, expecting them to move. Nothing happened. Around 4:30 in the morning I finally dozed off on the couch. I dreamed again of that ballroom. This time I stood at the center of the dance floor. The music was coming from my chest. My vision blurred for a second. I blinked, struggling to see clearly. The strings kept vibrating even though I had stopped plucking them. I heard a faint echo in the living room, like the tail end of a long cord. My skin felt clammy. I stepped back, worried I might lose my balance. The vibration faded and the room went silent. I set the harp down carefully and walked into the hallway. My legs felt weak. I leaned against the wall. My head pounded with tension. I tried to catch my breath. There was a ringing in my ears that wouldn't go away. I thought about calling someone or leaving the house, but I stayed. I felt too invested in what was happening. I couldn't just leave the harp behind, and I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. I wanted to find answers. I wanted to see if the dreams would show me more. I decided to spend the next few nights in the living room, sleeping on the couch. I set an alarm for every hour so I wouldn't miss any activity. From the harp my sleep became fragmented. I woke up exhausted each morning. The harp remained quiet. I started wondering if it was over. My stress level was high. My hands trembled all day. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked gaunt. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My jaw felt tense from clenching it. At night, on the seventh night of my vigil, I finally heard the harp again. It was around 3:30 in the morning. The chords sounded louder, more urgent. I sprang off the couch, my heart thumping. The strings were moving on their own. I grabbed my notebook, but I accidentally knocked it onto the floor. I cursed under my breath and picked it up. By the time I held my pen, the melody was nearly done. I recognized some of it. It matched the piece I had been practicing. My entire body felt like it was vibrating in sync with the notes. Then the music stopped. The air felt thick. I tasted something metallic on my tongue, like I'd been breathing in strange fumes. I listened, waiting for more. The strings went still. My eyes locked onto the top of the harp, where the faint markings were. This time, in the dim light of my lamp, I saw them more clearly. They formed a message I couldn't decipher. My stomach twisted. I realized I was gripping the pen so hard my knuckles were white. I put the pen down and touched the harp's pillar with my fingertips. The wood felt warm again. My heart pounded. I could feel each beat in my ears. I forced myself to let go. Then I backed up, turned off the lamp, and sat down on the couch. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Now I sit here still in the living room, the harp beside me. I keep looking at it, waiting to see if it will move or sound on its own again. My arms are crossed and my legs feel restless. I hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I can't stop thinking about those dreams and the way the harp seems to pull me into another time. I can't explain it with logic. I have this urge to keep playing, to learn every chord and measure. I don't know what will happen if I succeed, but I can't turn away from it. My eyes are heavy, but I'm determined. I plan to stay here all night, watching, listening, waiting for the harp's next note. I feel uneasy, but I won't leave. I need to see this Though I had no idea what I was getting into when I first stepped onto that plateau, I felt the dry heat hit my face. And the sun was right above me, my boots pressed into hard cracked ground. I looked around and saw nothing but dust and red-brown rock for miles. I was there because I'd heard rumors about strange rock formations that didn't match the usual geological patterns. I wasn't expecting anything else. I carried a small pack with water, some protein bars, and a camera. My car was parked a few miles back on the edge of the plateau where the sand turned into flat stone. As I walked, I saw random boulders. Some looked tall, others were smaller and jagged. I spent hours taking notes, snapping pictures, and checking the position of the sun. My throat felt dry. Sweat beat on my forehead and neck. The air was still. I heard only the crunch of my footsteps, the rustling of the faint desert breeze, and the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. I kept moving, careful with every step because the surface was uneven. One misstep, I could twist an ankle. I wasn't sure when I first noticed the circle of stones. I think my brain saw a shape that seemed too organized to be natural. From a distance it looked like a collection of upright rocks in a ring. I approached slowly. My mouth felt sticky and I took a sip of water. As I got closer I saw a perfect circle. The stones were all around the same height, about as tall as my waist. Each stone was spaced out with just enough room to walk through. If I turned sideways I counted my chest. My vision blurred for a second. I blinked, struggling to see clearly. The strings kept vibrating even though I had stopped plucking them. I heard a faint echo in the living room, like the tail end of a long cord. My skin felt clammy. I stepped back, worried I might lose my balance. The vibration faded and the room went silent. I set the harp down carefully and walked into the hallway. My legs felt weak. I leaned against the wall, my head pounded with tension. I tried to catch my breath. There was a ringing in my ears that wouldn't go away. I thought about calling someone or leaving the house, but I stayed. I felt too invested in what was happening. I couldn't just leave the harp behind, and I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. I wanted to find answers. I wanted to see if the dreams would show me more. I decided to spend the next few nights in the living room, sleeping on the couch. I set an alarm for every hour so I wouldn't miss any activity. From the harp my sleep became fragmented. I woke up exhausted each morning. The harp remained quiet. I started wondering if it was over. My stress level was high. My hands trembled all day. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked gaunt. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My jaw felt tense from clenching it. At night, on the 7th night of my vigil, I finally heard the harp again. It was around 3:30 in the morning. The chords sounded louder, more urgent. I sprang off the couch, my heart thumping. The strings were moving on their own. I grabbed my notebook, but I accidentally knocked it onto the floor. I cursed under my breath and picked it up. By the time I held my pen, the melody was nearly done. I recognized some of it. It matched the piece I had been practicing. My entire body felt like it was vibrating in sync with the notes. Then the music stopped. The air felt thick. I tasted something metallic on my tongue, like I'd been breathing in strange fumes. I listened, waiting for more. The strings went still. My eyes locked onto the top of the harp where the faint markings were. This time in the dim light of my lamp I saw them more clearly. They formed a message I couldn't decipher. My stomach twisted. I realized I was gripping the pen so hard my knuckles were white. I put the pen down and touched the harp's pillar with my fingertips. The wood felt warm again. My heart pounded. I could feel each beat in my ears. I forced myself to let go. Then I backed up, turned off the lamp, and sat down on the couch. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Now I sit here still in the living room, the harp beside me. I keep looking at it, waiting to see if it will move or sound on its own again. My arms are crossed and my legs feel restless. I hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I can't stop thinking about those dreams and the way the harp seems to pull me into another time. I can't explain it with logic. I have this urge to keep playing, to learn every chord and measure. I don't know what will happen if I succeed, but I can't turn away from it. My eyes are heavy, but I'm determined. I plan to stay here all night, watching, listening, waiting for the harp's next note. I feel uneasy, but I won't leave. I need to see this through. I had no idea what I was getting into when I first stepped onto that plateau. I felt the dry heat hit my face, and the sun was right above me. My boots pressed into hard cracked ground. I looked around and saw nothing but dust and red-brown rock for miles. I was there because I'd heard rumors about strange rock formations that didn't match the usual geological patterns. I wasn't expecting anything else. I carried a small pack with water, some protein bars, and a camera. My car was parked a few miles back on the edge of the plateau where the sand turned into flat stone. As I walked, I saw random boulders. Some looked tall, others were smaller and jagged. I spent hours taking notes, snapping pictures, and checking the position of the sun. My throat felt dry. Sweat beat on my forehead and neck. The air was still. I heard only the crunch of my footsteps, the rustling of the faint desert breeze, and the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. I kept moving, careful with every step because the surface was uneven. One misstep, I could twist an ankle. I wasn't sure when I first noticed the circle of stones. I think my brain saw a shape that seemed too organized to be natural. From A distance it looked like a collection of upright rocks in a ring. I approached. Slowly my mouth felt sticky and I took a sip of water. As I got closer I saw a perfect circle. The stones were all around the same height, about as tall as my waist. Each stone was spaced out with just enough room to walk through. If I turned sideways I counted them 12 stones. Placed in a neat ring on the plateau, I walked around them. Nothing seemed painted on their surfaces. They had rough edges and I saw small cracks where they had weathered over time. They were aligned in a precise way, but I couldn't figure out the exact alignment. I guessed it might have been some kind of old observatory, maybe used by people centuries ago. I looked at the sky, shielding my eyes from the harsh sun. The afternoon light felt brutal. My arms stung a bit, probably from a slight sunburn. I decided to stick around. I wanted to see if the formation had some special alignment with the sunset. I had a small tent in my pack plus enough water for a couple of days. I sat down near the circle and checked my watch. The day crawled by. The sun sank toward the horizon and the color of the sky changed. It turned from pale blue to a mix of orange and purple. I took more pictures crouched by the stones and ran my hand along their surfaces. I felt rough patches of rock like worn sandpaper. When the sun finally dropped behind the horizon, the temperature shifted fast. I unrolled a thin sleeping mat and set up a single pole tent. I lit a small lantern but kept it low because I wanted to see the sky. The air felt cooler. I got goosebumps on my arms. The quiet was intense. There was no sound of insects, no wind whistling. I heard my own breathing. I stood and walked around the circle, shining my flashlight occasionally so I wouldn't trip. I stopped when I thought I saw movement in the center of the circle. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The moon wasn't full, but it cast some light. I stepped closer. My flashlight beam wavered in the middle of that ring. There were dark shapes. They looked like people made of shadow without distinct features. They moved in a synchronized pattern, swaying in a slow dance. I felt a cold twist in my stomach. My hands tensed around the flashlight. I stayed outside the circle, maybe 30 feet away. My mouth hung open. I couldn't breathe right. My heart pounded. I pointed the flashlight at them, but the beam seemed to pass right through them like they weren't solid. They kept dancing. Each figure moved in a slow drifting way, raising what looked like arms, then lowering them. My legs felt heavy and a buzz started in my head. I swallowed hard and tried to think. I asked myself if I should run to my tent, grab my stuff, and get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. I watched them for a while, then I realized they were looking in my direction, or at least facing me. They didn't have eyes or faces, but I felt their attention. My flashlight started flickering. I shook it. A faint beep from my watch told me it was late. The moonlight made everything around me looked pale. The circle of stones appeared darker than before, and the shadow figures were right in the center. Suddenly they stopped dancing. They stood still as if frozen in place. The air felt tight around my chest. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. Then one of them lifted an arm in a way that reminded me of how I was holding my flashlight. I stepped back, but the figure copied my movement in a weird, stretched way. My arms began to shake. I tried to stay calm, but my breath came in quick gasps. Another shadow shape tilted its head. I did the same thing without meaning to. Then I realized it was mimicking me, or maybe forcing me to mimic it. I'm not sure. I heard a dull ringing in my ears. Every time I moved my arm or turned my head, I saw them do it in the center of the circle, but with slight distortions. Their limbs looked elongated, like they were pulling at the edges of the darkness. My scalp prickled. I wanted to run, but something pinned me in place. My legs trembled. My throat felt dry. The figures kept shifting around as if they were testing the limits of their shape. I finally managed to step backward. I stumbled on a small rock and almost fell. One of the shadows jerked in a similar way and its torso twisted. I heard a low hiss, or maybe a faint scrape like nails on stone. I turned off my flashlight. The moonlight was dim, but the shadows were still visible. They had a faint glow around their edges like black outlines. I felt cold sweat on my neck and my hair stood up. The compulsion to walk into that circle hit me. Then it was a sudden pull in my gut. It felt like a tug behind my navel. My mind screamed at me to stay away. My heart pounded so hard I thought my chest might burst, but my feet wanted to move forward. My entire body felt drawn to that spot like there was a rope around my waist. I tried to fight it. I pressed my heels into the ground and clenched my fists, but with each second the urge grew. It was like an itch under my skin that I couldn't scratch. I glanced at my tent. It was just a short jog away. The idea of zipping myself up inside a flimsy layer of fabric didn't feel safe. I'd still be near the circle. I'd still be vulnerable. I looked back at the shadows. They were swaying again slowly, but they weren't dancing in their initial pattern. Now they seemed to be waiting. I heard a soft wind pick up, which was the first time I felt a breeze since sunset. The night air felt colder on my sweaty face. I stepped forward. My left foot moved without me wanting it to. The shadows raised their arms again. I thought I heard a soft hum like a vibration in the air. I tried to focus on my breathing. My chest rose and fell in short bursts. My heart rate felt out of control. I took another step forward. My mind told me to stop, but my body was giving in. I tried to speak or yell, but my voice came out in a trembling whisper. I heard my Own words echo in my ears. Stop it. I forced my right foot to stay in place. I shifted my weight back, but it felt like the ground was pulling me. The circle was about 10 feet away now. I could see the stones more clearly. Their surfaces had faint scratches, lines that formed patterns I hadn't noticed before. I could smell the dusty air. My nose was dry and my tongue felt rough in my mouth. I took a half step forward again, unsteady. The shadows seemed to pulse. They rose a bit taller, as if drawn to me. The humming sound grew louder. I felt it vibrating in my chest, rattling my wrist cage. The wind whipped across the plateau, stirring up a bit of dust, stinging my eyes. I blinked hard and rubbed them for a second. My vision blurred and I saw the shapes flicker. They still copied me though. When I lifted my hand to wipe sweat off my forehead, they lifted their hands too. In that twisted, unnatural motion, I pulled in a shaky breath. My eyes stung from sweat and dust. I stood there staring at them. I wanted to break free from that pull. Part of me just wanted to collapse to the ground, but I took another step forward instead. Now I was only a few feet from the ring of stones. I could have touched one of them if I reached out my arm. I felt a surge of adrenaline. My fingers tingled, my stomach churned. I tried to push my body backward, but it refused. It was like I was on a track leading straight into that circle. I heard my pulse in my ears. My forehead was damp and sweat dripped down the side of my face. I wiped my cheek. My hand shook. The shadows parted slightly, making a gap right in front of me. An open path into the center. I stepped between two stones. The temperature dropped even more. My breath hitched. The ground felt softer. My knees wobbled. I saw my shadow on the ground in front of me, stretched by the moonlight, but it didn't match my movements perfectly. When I lifted my left hand, my shadow's left hand moved a split second later, then caught up. I heard a faint crunch under my boots, like small pebbles grinding. The humming grew louder, filling my skull. I inched closer to the center, and the shadow figures surrounded me, circling me in slow arcs. I smelled dust in the faint odor of sulfur. My eyes watered. My heart pounded so hard that my chest hurt. The shadows extended their arms and legs, making a wide ring around me. Each time I shifted my weight or twitched my fingers, they imitated me. I felt a tingling in my fingertips and a heavy ache in my calves. My thoughts were jumbled. I couldn't form a clear plan. My entire focus was on the shapes around me. I could see no eyes or mouths, just outlines of heads and limbs. They stayed a few feet away but blocked any clear path out. I turned my head, scanning for an opening. Every time I moved, they moved too. My breath came in shallow gasps. I said, "Let me out," in a low, shaky voice. They made no sound, but I saw them tilt their heads in unison. I raised both hands, trying to show I wasn't aggressive. My muscles felt stiff. They mirrored me, lifting their arms. My chest felt tight. A faint rattling sensation went up my spine. I took a slow step backward toward the edge of the circle. They took a matching step forward, staying in a ring around me. My legs shook and I dropped to my knees, panting. My mouth tasted sour. The dust on my tongue made me gag. I stayed there for a few seconds on my knees, head bowed, feeling the grit between my teeth. The humming noise softened a bit. I lifted my head. The shadows swayed slightly, as if they were waiting. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. My arms felt like lead. I forced myself to stand up again. My knees wobbled. I tried to move sideways. The shadow ring moved with me, each shape perfectly synchronized. I turned around, scanning the stones. My flashlight was off, dangling at my side. I pressed the button with my thumb and a weak beam lit up the dark shapes. They flickered. I felt a sudden wave of dizziness. The compulsion to stay inside the circle was still there. I could barely form a coherent thought. My body felt cold. My shirt clung to my back. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. Then I heard a crack behind me. It was just my foot hitting a small rock, but it sounded loud. In that silent place I spun around and the shadows twitched in response. My flashlight flickered. I decided to make a run for it. Even though I could barely hold my balance, I lunged forward, aiming for the gap between two shadows. They parted just enough for me to pass, then turned. As I stumbled out of the ring, I scraped my hand on one of the stones and felt a sharp sting. I hissed in pain, but I kept moving. I bolted a few steps away and turned around. The shadows stood in the circle, swaying again, but they didn't follow me outside. My breath was rough and ragged. I felt a searing ache in my lungs. My hand bled a bit from the scrape, and I wiped it on my pants. My eyes watered from the mixture of fear and dust. I took one last look at the dark figures. They raised their arms again, dancing in the moonlight. I heard the humming fade. My body trembled. I forced myself to walk away. Every step felt uncertain. I didn't dare look back again until I reached the spot where my tent stood. When I finally turned, I couldn't see them. The circle of stones stood there, silent and dark. I collapsed onto my sleeping mat, still shaking. The air around me felt heavy and suffocating, but it was better than being inside that ring. I didn't sleep much that night. My eyes stayed open, scanning the plateau for any sign of movement. I watched the moon cross the sky. I heard the wind pick up and drop again. At dawn, I stood up, packed my tent, and scanned the horizon one last time. The stones were still there. They looked harmless in the daylight. No sign of those shadows. My legs felt weak as I walked away. I didn't break Into a run I kept a steady pace, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The sunlight felt hot on my back and my lips were cracked every time I thought of the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. When I finally got to my car, I tossed my pack inside and slammed the door. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked pale and tense. My eyes twitched. I started the engine and drove off, heading as far from that plateau as I could. I didn't have a plan besides getting away. My mind still reeled from what I'd seen. I can't explain it, I only know it felt real, and the memory still makes my stomach clench. Those stones that circle, those shadows, I don't know what they were. I just know I never want to see them again. I never thought my apartment could make me feel uneasy. It's just a place filled with everyday furniture and a bunch of mirrors that I put up to brighten things and make the space feel bigger. I liked how the reflections made every room look open, but one night I noticed something in one of those mirrors that almost made me drop my phone. It was another reflection right beside mine. Even though I was alone in the apartment, it flickered for a few seconds, then vanished. I stood there staring at the mirror, feeling my pulse throb in my neck. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but my chest felt tight and my skin broke out in goosebumps. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen someone else in that glass. My name is Andrew. I'm 32 and I live alone in a small one-bedroom place on the 10th floor of a quiet building. Nothing about my daily routine is remarkable. I work from home, mostly on freelance graphic design projects. My apartment is neat, though I keep a few boxes in the corner that I never unpacked. The main living area has a simple couch facing a TV mounted on the wall. Around the corners on both sides there are mirrors of different sizes. Some stand on the floor with wooden frames, others hang on the wall with minimal metal borders. At first I installed them because I liked how they reflected light from the windows. The place felt twice as big, but now those mirrors make me feel watched. A few nights ago I was heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. The lights were low, but I could still see my reflection in a large mirror I'd hung behind the couch. That's when I first noticed the second figure in the glass. It was almost like an overexposed image of me. The face had my shape, but the eyes had a weird dark shimmer. I froze in place, feeling a jolt of panic crawl up my spine. My stomach tense and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Then, just as quickly, the figure disappeared, leaving only my normal reflection behind. I stepped closer, pressing a shaky hand against the frame. My heart was hammering so hard that I could hear it pulsing in my ears. I waited a minute, staring at every corner of that mirror. Nothing unusual. My reflection stared back at me with tired eyes, messed up hair, and a worried expression. I flipped on the overhead light. Still just me alone at that moment. I wanted to tear the mirror off the wall, but I felt silly. I told myself it had to be a trick of the shadows or my imagination. Maybe I was just tired and my eyes were playing games with me. I turned off the light, rubbed my face, and tried to ignore the creeping tension in my body. Then I went back to bed. The next morning I felt drained. My mind kept returning to that strange reflection. I decided to examine the mirror more thoroughly. The frame was stirred and there were no cracks on the glass. My windows were closed, so there wasn't any breeze or movement that could distort a reflection by daylight. It looked ordinary. I tried looking at it from different angles, stepping from side to side, but I only saw my normal reflection. I even pressed my hand against it, half expecting the glass to feel different. It was cool and smooth, just a standard mirror. That day I tried to focus on my work. I had a deadline looming and I needed to finish a set of digital images for a client. My hands were shaking a bit on my keyboard. I kept glancing to the left where a small mirrored panel hung near my desk. It had never bothered me before, but now I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking at it out of the corner of my eye, waiting for something strange to appear. The hours went by and nothing happened. After I finished my project, I started to wonder if I just had a vivid hallucination. That night I was in my bedroom brushing my teeth in front of the mirror attached to my closet door. I spit out the toothpaste and rinsed my mouth. I looked up and for a split second I saw that same figure standing behind my left shoulder. It was faint, but it had that same disturbing glow in its eyes. My mouth dried up and my hand holding the toothbrush jerked. I whipped around. No one was there. I slowly turned back to face the mirror, feeling my muscles tighten from my neck down to my lower back. The reflection was normal again, but my chest was pounding and I was breathing hard. I stood there for a solid minute holding my breath. I flicked the bedroom light on and off, testing every angle. Nothing else happened. Over the next few days I started seeing that figure in more of my mirrors. It wouldn't stay long. Sometimes I'd catch it in the corner of my eye and other times it was front and center. Each time it seemed a bit clearer or maybe a bit closer. I noticed it in the bathroom mirror while washing my hands or in the little mirror I keep by the door when I was putting on a jacket. The worst part was the expression in its eyes. They looked like my eyes but with a dark flicker. It reminded me of how animals' eyes can shine at night, except there was something hostile in the way it locked onto me. I felt a heaviness settle in my stomach. Every time I caught sight of it my throat would tighten and I'd usually whisper a Startled curse under my breath, I tried covering some of the mirrors with old sheets, especially the big one in the living room. I felt silly, but I just didn't want to look at them anymore. I was tired of glancing at a reflection that might have something else in it. A friend of mine who lives in another part of the city called to check on me, and I almost told him what was going on, but I held back. I knew how insane it sounded to say a second reflection was following me around in my own mirrors. Instead, I mumbled something about being busy and not feeling too great. My friend offered to come over, but I said no, I didn't want anyone else getting freaked out by this. I wasn't sure how to explain it anyway. A few days later, I tried to ignore the mirrors altogether. I hurried past them, avoided looking at them, and kept the lights brighter in every room. I started sleeping with a small lamp on by the bed, but each night it found a way to make me aware of its presence. Sometimes I'd see movement in the mirror by my closet door. Other times I'd catch a glimpse of that figure in the reflection of the TV screen. My heart would pound and I'd break out in sweat. It didn't matter how much I told myself, it was all in my head each time I saw it. My arms and legs tensed up and my stomach felt like it was filled with cold water. One night I stayed up late on the couch trying to distract myself with some TV show. I had the big mirror behind me covered, but there was still a thin mirror across the room behind the TV stand. Around 2 a.m. I sensed movement in that mirror. I tried to ignore it at first, focusing on the show's audio, but I felt this prickling on my skin like someone was staring at me. I paused the TV and turned my head. In the mirror, that figure was there, looking straight at me. The face had my jawline, my nose, my haircut, but the eyes were darker and narrower. My reflection was turned to the side, but this figure was facing me dead on. I dropped the remote, it clattered on the floor. I could see my chest rising and falling and my hands shook. The other figure just kept looking at me. Then it stepped forward in the reflection, getting closer to the glass. Even though I was sitting still, I gasped and scrambled to get up. I actually slid off the couch in a panic, grabbing at the cushions to keep my balance. When I looked back, the mirror only showed me on the floor, panting with wide eyes. I felt sweat trickling down the sides of my face. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the living room with all the lights on, scanning the walls and the floor, trying to calm my breathing. I considered leaving my apartment, maybe staying at a hotel or calling a friend, but a weird sense of shame held me back. I was afraid to tell anyone about this. It all felt so bizarre. I kept telling myself it wasn't possible. Mirrors just reflect what's in front of them. They don't produce new images. The next morning I woke up still on the couch, with the sun shining through the windows. At least I dozed off for a bit. My back was sore and my neck felt stiff. I stretched and stood up. The covers were still on the big mirror, but the smaller ones were uncovered. I tried to go about my day, but I was on edge. Every time I passed a mirror, I tensed. My shoulders felt permanently tight and I kept swallowing hard. I walked around the apartment, double-checking every door and window, half expecting to find signs of an intruder. Of course, everything was locked. The only problem was in the reflections. Later that afternoon, I went into the bathroom to wash my face. I'd been sweating from anxiety. I leaned over the sink, turned on the faucet, and splashed water on my cheeks. When I looked up, it was there again. This time it was right behind my left shoulder, standing so close that in the reflection I could almost feel its presence. My blood went cold. I could see its eyes locked on me and its mouth was set in a grim line. I didn't move for a few seconds. My arms trembled. Then in the reflection, the figure raised its arm. I felt something brush my shoulder in real life and I yelped. I spun around and the bathroom was empty. I almost stumbled onto the tiles, knocking my hip against the sink. My breathing was ragged and my heart pounded so hard I felt dizzy. I shut off the faucet and slammed the bathroom door behind me. I needed to do something. I couldn't just keep letting this thing show up whenever it wanted. I grabbed a screwdriver from the small toolbox I keep by the coat rack. I went to the bedroom and started prying the mirror off my closet door. It was a cheap mirror that came with the apartment. The nails squealed and a chunk of the door frame chipped off, but I finally got it loose. I took the mirror, carried it into my living room, and leaned it against the wall. My hands were shaking so much I had to sit down. I looked at the covered mirror behind the couch. I decided I had to remove all the mirrors from this place, but something told me it wouldn't help. That thing showed up in reflections I couldn't even remove, like the TV screen or the window at night. Still, I started unhooking some of the smaller mirrors and stacking them in the hallway. I felt my muscles ache from the stress and my mouth was dry. I checked the time. It was 7 p.m. Darkness would come soon. I turned on every light in the apartment, including the small lamps in the bedroom and living room. Around 9 p.m. I was pacing the hallway, trying to figure out if I should smash the mirrors or just put them in the building storage downstairs. That's when I noticed movement on the covered mirror in the living room. The sheet over it moved like someone brushed it from underneath. My lungs constricted and I froze. I stared at that sheet, hoping I'd imagine the movement. Then I saw it again, a distinct shift, like a hand pressing against the cloth. I felt my face burn, turning with adrenaline, and I took a step toward it. Holding the screwdriver in my hand, I got close enough to see a slight bulge against the fabric. My palms were Sweating and my heart pounded in my ears, I tugged the sheet down in one quick motion. The mirror was blank for a moment. I saw my own reflection looking pale and wildy, holding a screwdriver. Then behind me the figure appeared. It was closer than ever, almost shoulder to shoulder with me, my eyes locked on it. In the reflection, the figure's lips were parted slightly like it was about to speak, but no sound came out. My skin tingled and I exhaled through clenched teeth. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything. I raised the screwdriver and slammed it into the mirror. A deafening crack filled the room. The glass split into spiderweb lines. A few shards fell to the floor. My reflection broke into jagged pieces and the figure's shape distorted. I stumbled backward, almost trying over my own feet. I stood there panting, staring at the shattered mirror. My heartbeat was still going crazy and I felt unsteady. I kept checking the other mirrors around me, half expecting to see that thing appear somewhere else. For a few minutes nothing moved. The apartment was silent except for my heavy breathing. Finally I grabbed a broom from the kitchen closet and swept up the broken glass. I kept glancing at my reflection in the other mirrors, but I didn't see that second figure. When I finished cleaning, I leaned the broken mirror against the wall facing the floor. I felt exhausted and tense, like I just sprinted a mile. It's been a few hours since I shattered that mirror. I'm still in the living room surrounded by stacked mirrors and broken shards. My hands won't stop trembling and my temples throb with each heartbeat. I don't know if I chased that thing away or if it's just waiting for another chance to show up in a different reflection. I can still feel its eyes on me, sometimes like a lingering pressure on my shoulders. I'm not sure if it's my nerves or something else. All I know is that I don't trust any reflective surface in this apartment anymore. I keep thinking about leaving, but I'm too wired to step out. Maybe I'll grab my coat, pack a bag and just walk out the door, or maybe I'll get rid of every mirror in this place, throw them all out and hope that thing can't follow me. Right now I'm just trying not to look too long into any mirror. I'm scared that if I see that figure again, it'll be the last time I recognize which one of us is real. I arrived at that old rural property with a sense of curiosity and a tight feeling in my chest. The land was overgrown and the house looked worn on the outside. The front porch sagged a bit and the windows were cloudy with dust. I was there because I needed details for a historical research project about old settlement patterns in the area. I remember stepping out of my truck and hearing nothing except the wind rustling through dry grass. It felt like the place hadn't been touched in decades. I walked toward the barn first. The wood siding was gray and splintered. There were a few broken tools lying in a corner and the air inside smelled like mold and old hay. I saw spiderwebs in every corner. I didn't spend much time in there. My mind was set on exploring the rest of the property to see if there were any clues about previous owners. I had a notebook and a small camera to document the place. The barn didn't give me anything interesting except a feeling of abandonment. My next stop was the house itself, but something else caught my eye first. Behind the house, near a cluster of trees, there was a circular shape covered by rotting boards. The boards were cracked and discolored and I could smell the dampness even from a few steps away. When I moved closer, I saw it was a stone well. The rim was made of old rocks stacked in a neat circle. They were dark with age and covered in patches of moss. The boards on top looked like they'd been thrown there haphazardly, probably to keep animals or debris from falling in. I felt drawn to it. I leaned over and tried to peer inside through the gaps in the boards, but it was too dark. The smell from that opening was stale and cold. It was more like a draft coming from inside rather than a smell rising out. I decided to remove the boards. I wedged my crowbar under the edge of one plank and pried it up. The wood snapped easily and I set it aside. One by one I lifted them until I revealed the open mouth of the well. I expected to see water. Instead I saw only darkness that seemed to go down forever. I picked up a small stone from the ground and dropped it, and I waited for the sound of it hitting water. Instead I heard something that sounded like a faint whisper. At first I thought I heard the rock bounce against the walls, but that wasn't what it sounded like. The noise that echoed back had a strange pitch to it. It was like someone speaking from far below, but I couldn't make out the words. I stood there for a moment, confused. I cleared my throat and waited. Then I heard an echo of my own cough, but it came back distorted, like it was shaping itself into syllables. I felt my arms prickle with goosebumps. I leaned over the edge again, but I couldn't see anything. I tried another noise. I tapped the crowbar against the stone rim. The echo returned after a moment, but the sound was twisted, like a low voice trying to repeat what I'd done. It wasn't just an echo, it was like an attempt at speech. My mouth went dry. I wanted to believe it was some kind of acoustic trick, but it didn't feel normal. I tossed another stone, and this time I heard a soft murmur come back. It almost sounded like it said something. I strained to listen, but the echo faded away. I decided to move on and check the house before I lost the entire day on the well. Inside the house, the air was stale. The living room had old furniture covered with sheets, and the floorboards creaked with every step. I opened a few doors, found a kitchen with rusted appliances, and saw a set of stairs leading to the second floor. Everything looked abandoned, with dust floors and Cobwebs in the corner, still I couldn't get that strange well out of my head. I tried to focus on my notes, but every time I wrote something down, my mind wandered back to those echoes. After a couple of hours, I realized the sun was going down. I decided to camp there for the night. I had a sleeping bag in my truck, and I wasn't afraid of old houses. I made myself comfortable in a corner of the living room away from the windows. I turned on a small lantern I carried with me. I ate a sandwich and drank some water. I was tired but not relaxed. I felt an urge to go back outside and look at the well again, but I told myself it could wait until morning. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept drifting. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It sounded like footsteps on gravel, and I thought it might be an animal. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and walked to the front door. The night was dark and the sky was cloudy. I didn't see anything in the yard, but I heard another faint crunch of gravel near the side of the house. I followed the sound carefully, shining my flashlight around the beam, picked up the barn, the fence, and the outline of the trees. Then I heard the noise again, closer to the well. I walked slowly toward it, feeling the hair on my arm stand up. My heart was thumping so hard that I couldn't hear much else. I aimed the flashlight at the well. The stones looked the same, the boards still piled to the side. Then I heard a soft voice. It sounded like it was coming from the hole. It said my name. It was distorted, like someone was whispering through a broken speaker, but it was definitely my name. I froze. I thought I might be imagining things, but the voice spoke again, the syllables strained and etch-all-likey. It made the back of my neck tingle. I went right to the edge and aimed the flashlight down. The light only reached a few feet before the darkness swallowed it up. I couldn't see the bottom. I waited, but I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no rustling, just the night wind and my own breath. My hands were shaking a bit, so I backed away. I tried to calm down by telling myself it could be some echo phenomenon, but hearing my own name that felt wrong. I returned to the house and locked the door as if that would help. I sat in the living room for hours listening for more sounds. Finally, I dozed off around dawn. In the morning, I decided I'd had enough, but I also felt an urge to investigate. I had come there for research, but now I wanted to understand what was happening with that well. I thought maybe there was some hidden chamber or something that caused these unusual echoes. I walked back outside after a quick breakfast of dried fruit. The sun was up and everything looked normal. The well was just a hole with stone walls open to the sky. The boards I'd removed were still lying to the side warped and damp. I leaned over the edge and called out, "Hello." My voice echoed back after a moment, but it was faint. It didn't repeat my name this time. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. I took out a length of rope I had in the truck. I tied one end to a sturdy fence post and pulled on it to test its strength. My plan was to lower myself just a little bit inside to see if I could see any ledges or openings. My heart pounded in my chest as I secured the rope around my waist and carefully eased myself over the rim of the well. The inside walls were cold and damp to the touch. They were made of the same stacked stones, only slicker. I moved down a few feet, shining my flashlight. I couldn't see much, just more darkness. The air smelled stale, like trapped earth. I made a few attempts to tap on the walls to check for hollows. The sounds echoed, but nothing strange echoed back. Right then I felt uneasy hanging there, so I climbed back up. My arms were trembling from the tension. When I reached the top, I sat on the grass, breathing hard. I couldn't explain what I'd heard the night before. Maybe I'd been tired and overheard the wind, but I knew I heard my name. That wasn't normal. I spent the rest of the day looking around the property for any sign of records or old papers. I searched the house, the attic, and the barn. I found a few dusty ledgers in the attic, but they were incomplete and didn't mention anything about a well. I tried to distract myself with this work, but I kept glancing at the window. The well was always on my mind. By late afternoon, I felt restless. My heart would speed up whenever I remembered that distorted voice. When the sun went down, I sat on the front porch with a flashlight and waited. I don't know what I was expecting. Part of me wanted to hear the footsteps again so I could catch whatever was out there. Part of me wanted silence. The night was quiet for a long time. Then around midnight, I heard its slow, deliberate steps near the well. I stood up and walked toward the sound. My flashlight beam shook in my hand. I shined it around, but I didn't see anyone. The steps stopped when I got close. My breath was shallow and my hands were sweating. I stepped up to the well and peered over the edge. I whispered, "Is anybody there?" The echo came back, but it was just my whisper repeated in a jumbled way. I waited, my eyes scanning the darkness. Then I heard something inside. It was like a low murmur followed by a gentle scraping sound, like something shifting against the stone. I leaned forward. My foot slipped a little on the loose gravel and I had to steady myself with one hand on the rim. My heart was pounding like a drum in my ears. The voice spoke again, and it used my name. It sounded closer this time, not as distant as before. It was still distorted, but I caught the exact syllables of my name. The hair on my neck stood up and I felt a chill race through my entire body. I couldn't bring myself to speak. I just stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what I was hearing. The voice repeated my name once more, dragging out the last letter in a strange hiss. Then I heard a light scuffling noise, like feet shuffling on stone far below my hands. were shaking so badly that I dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the edge and bounced down into the darkness. I heard it hit something, and for a moment I saw the faint glow of it shining on the rough walls. Then it disappeared. I considered finding a rope and going down after the flashlight, but I wasn't thinking clearly. My gut told me that I shouldn't do it. I couldn't see anything and I felt exposed leaning over the edge. Then I noticed something else. There were faint footprints in the dirt near the well. They were shaped like normal shoes, but I couldn't tell if they were fresh or old. The ground was soft from the recent rain, so they looked new to me. My head started to ache and I felt a weight in my stomach. It didn't make sense. Nobody was supposed to be on this property except me. I heard another scraping noise inside the well. It sounded like something brushing against the stones. There was a short pause, then a whisper. It was too soft to understand, but it felt like a question or a command. I felt this strange pull, like I was being drawn closer. My feet inched forward on their own. I realized I was leaning toward the well mouth again. I forced myself to step back. I couldn't stand out there any longer. I raced to the house, got inside and locked the door. I spent the rest of that night with my back against the wall, holding another flashlight and a hammer for protection. I heard more footsteps outside circling the well. They stopped occasionally, then started up again, always close to that stone ring. When the first light of dawn came, I walked out onto the porch. The morning air felt cool and a light fog covered the ground. The boards around the well were damp and I saw fresh footprints circling it. My gut clenched. I realized I needed to leave, but something told me I had to stay for at least one more day to figure out if I could make sense of this. I couldn't just walk away without some kind of explanation. Throughout the day I approached the well several times. I tried speaking into it, tapping on the stones or dropping small rocks. Sometimes I'd hear nothing, sometimes I'd hear faint murmurs, but I didn't hear my name again. During daylight that night I heard more footsteps. I stayed in the house, heart pounding, listening to them circle the well. Sometimes they paused, then moved on. Once I heard a low hum echoing from inside the well itself. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see any shape or figure. Eventually I forced myself to sleep. At sunrise I made my decision. I packed up my notes and my gear. I walked over to the well one last time. The boards were still on the ground. I looked inside. The darkness didn't give me any final sign or sound. It was silent. I felt a chill on my arms and I backed away. Then I went to my truck, started it, and drove off the property, leaving the well behind. I don't know what was down there. I only know what I heard and felt. Even now, when I recall the way it called my name, my skin prickles. I can't explain it. All I can do is remember how it felt to look into that deep pit and sense something. Looking back, I haven't gone back to that property since, but sometimes late at night I think I hear a faint echo of my name, and it reminds me of that empty well waiting in the dark. I still remember the day I first saw that rocking chair at the estate auction. The place smelled like old wood and dust, and the crowd was scattered around looking for bargains. I walked in without any specific plan. Then I spotted the chair. It was tucked away in a corner, surrounded by a few side tables and mismatched lamps. The wood had scratches, and the seat cushion looked faded, but something about the shape and the smooth curves caught my attention. I ran my hand along the back. My fingertips picked up a slight grain that felt solid under my touch. I didn't even try to haggle much. When bidding started, I just wanted it. By the end of the auction, it was mine. I drove home feeling satisfied, like I had snagged a piece of history. The auctioneer mentioned the chair came from a rundown house in the countryside. He didn't say much else, but he gave me a look when I told him I wanted it. I didn't ask questions. I drove back, got the chair into my living room and placed it near the window. I remember the soft scraping sound as I slid it across the floor. I liked how it looked. It gave my living room a rustic feel that I hadn't realized I missed. I usually keep my living room quiet. I read there sometimes, or watch a bit of TV. The first time I noticed something off was late at night, a couple of days after I brought the chair, and it was around midnight. My house was silent, no traffic outside. I was half asleep on the couch. Then I heard a faint creaking noise. It sounded like an old hinge opening and closing. It was rhythmic and slow. At first I thought it was a branch tapping on the window or maybe the floor settling, but the sound was too even. I looked across the room and saw the rocking chair moving just a bit. It was slight, but there was definite motion. I sat up and stared at it, trying to see if a draft or something else could be responsible. The window was closed. The air felt still. A little chill ran through my arms and I felt the hair on my neck prickle. I walked over to the chair and touched it. The wood felt cool and the chair stopped moving the second my hand rested on the back. I looked around, ground feeling a bit foolish. I told myself maybe I'd bumped the floor somehow. When I stood up I didn't see anything else that made sense, but I let it go. I headed to bed feeling uneasy but not scared. I fell asleep reminding myself that old furniture sometimes makes noises. Wood expands or the frame. Front door. I stood there, heart hammering. A shiver rushed over me. My eyes teared up and I felt a pulse in my temples. Then as fast as I saw him, he was gone. The chair kept rocking for one more second, then stopped. I exhaled so hard that my chest hurt. My whole body shook. My first thought was that I was hallucinating. I Rubbed my eyes, but everything else in the room looked normal. The door was closed, the furniture was where it always was. The house was silent, but I could still feel that chill in the air. I ran upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and lay in bed with the lights on. My mind raced. I couldn't explain it in any logical way. I knew I saw him. I felt it in my gut. The next morning I tried to gather myself. I went downstairs, half expecting the chair to be in a strange position, but it looked normal. I walked up to it carefully. Nothing happened. I touched the seat and it felt cold to the touch, colder than the air around it. My skin crawled. I felt a tightening in my chest again, so I pulled my hand away and went about my routine. That evening I avoided the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, ate dinner, and tried to distract myself with a magazine. Eventually I had to pass by the living room to head upstairs. I paused at the doorway and looked at the chair. It was angled slightly toward the door. It didn't move. I still felt my pulse thumping in my throat. I started noticing a pattern over the next several days. The chair would act up at odd hours, mostly late at night or early in the morning. Sometimes it would make a soft, repetitive creaking sound like someone gently rocking. Other times I'd find it pointed at the front door as if waiting for someone sitting in it. Gave me that crawling sensation every time. I couldn't last more than a minute before standing up. I checked behind me, checked the corners of the room, then head upstairs. My shoulders tense. Each night I felt anxious about seeing that figure again. I'd stay up watching the living room from the stairs, trying to catch a glimpse. Sometimes I heard a faint squeak, sometimes nothing. Every so often I'd feel a cold draft from the direction of the chair. My eyes would water and my heart would pound. I kept telling myself to sell it or get rid of it, but a stubborn part of me wanted an explanation. I considered setting up a camera, but I hesitated. I was scared of what I might see. One evening I gathered the courage to sit across from the chair with a small lamp on. I just watched it, waiting for any sign of movement. The house was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. My leg bounced up and down. My breathing was shallow and my palms felt damp. After a while the air in the room felt colder. I saw the chair rock once, then twice. My heart beat thundered in my ears. The rocking continued for maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. I leaned forward on the couch, gripping the cushions, ready to jump up if I saw anything else. The chair stayed still. My hands shook. I stood, turned off the lamp, and walked to my bedroom. In a das tonight I'm telling you this story because I can't keep it bottled up. The chair is still in my house. It's in the same place near the window, angled just so sometimes during the day it looks perfectly normal. I'll walk by and it's just an old piece of furniture, but late at night I feel that cold presence. I hear the floor creak and the faint squeak of the rocker. If I look for fast enough I catch a glimpse of that old man's silhouette. He's always facing the door, swaying gently like he's waiting for someone. Every time it happens my heart races and I feel an electric current run along my arms. I still don't have a solid explanation. I've thought about calling a professional, but I don't even know who to call. A furniture restorer, a paranormal investigator. Right now I'm stuck with this bizarre situation. I haven't told many people because it sounds ridiculous, but every night I feel the tension in the air. I sense movement in the living room and I remember what I saw, an old man, spectral and quiet, rocking back and forth as if he has nowhere else to go. That's what's happening in my house. That's what I'm living with every day, and I don't know how it